Medieval life, a gentle journey through peasant routine. Gentle introduction to lull you to sleep. Welcome back to the channel. Today we'll travel to a distant past, to a small village in medieval Europe, where life was simple, hard, and surprisingly peaceful. We'll discover how a typical peasant family lived inside their humble home, where time passed slowly, and every detail of the routine played an important role. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and prepare yourself for a calm and comforting journey through the forgotten history of medieval daily life. Our path takes us to a small village from the 13th century, nestled between verdant hills and golden wheat fields, a place where time flows to the rhythm of the seasons, not of clocks, where each morning begins with the rooster's crow and ends when the last light of day disappears over the horizon. A world without hurry, without technology, where hands do all the work and the heart commands life. Imagine yourself arriving at this village at dawn. Mist still hovers over the fields, damp with dew. Smoke rises slowly from thatched roofs, forming thin grey columns against the light blue sky. The sounds are soft, the distant lowing of cattle, the creaking of a wooden wheel, the rhythmic pounding of a pestle crushing grain. It's as if the air itself were denser, laden with the aromas of earth, wood, freshly baked bread, and herbs hanging to dry. Welcome to a world that no longer exists, except in our memories and stories. A world where we'll spend the next hours walking softly through the cobblestone paths, peeking through the open doors of houses, and observing the simple yet profound routines of those who built our history, one day at a time, one season after another. The home environment. The medieval peasant's house was made of clay, wood, and straw. The floor was packed earth, and the walls barely kept out the icy winter wind. The roof, covered with dry straw, needed to be changed frequently. There were few windows, and light came mainly from the fire that burned slowly in the center of the house, a rustic hearth without a chimney that released smoke through the roof. This humble dwelling, so different from our modern homes, was more than just a shelter. It was the very center of family life. Built with materials found nearby, the house itself told a story of adaptation and symbiosis with nature. The walls were often created using a technique called wattle and daub, a wooden framework filled with a mixture of clay, straw, animal dung, and sometimes blood or hair to strengthen it. This created a remarkably durable material that, when properly maintained, could last for decades. The roof was a masterpiece of practicality. Layers upon layers of thatched straw or reeds, carefully bundled and tied, created a surprisingly waterproof covering. When properly constructed, these thatched roofs could shed water for 20 years or more before needing replacement. In winter, the thick layer of thatch provided insulation against the cold. In summer, it kept the interior wonderfully cool. The highest point of the roof often featured crossed wooden beams, partly decorative, partly structural, and partly believed to ward off evil spirits and lightning. If you were to stand at the doorway of such a house, the first thing to strike you would be the dimness. Your eyes would need time to adjust from the bright outdoors. The few windows, if any, were small openings covered with oiled parchment or thin animal bladders, materials that allowed some diffused light to enter while keeping out the worst of the weather. Glass was far too expensive for peasant homes and reserved for churches and noble residences. The space inside was entirely open. No separate rooms divided the living areas. This single room served every purpose of daily life. One corner might hold a rough wooden table and benches where the family took their meals. Another corner might contain the family's most precious possessions, perhaps a wooden chest with extra clothing, a family heirloom, or seeds saved for next season's planting. The walls were bare except for tools hanging from pegs, a sickle, for harvesting perhaps, or a wooden rake. The central feature was the hearth, not pushed against a wall as in later centuries, but positioned in the middle of the room. This open fire served as the family's source of heat, light, and cooking facility. Above it, a hook or chain descended from the roof beams, allowing pots to be suspended over the flames. The smoke from this fire would rise and, finding no chimney, would eventually filter out through the thatch or through a small opening in the roof. This constant smoke had an unexpected benefit. It helped preserve the thatch and wooden beams by deterring insects and preventing rot. This smoky interior, though harsh on the eyes and lungs by our modern standards, created a peculiar kind of comfort. The upper reaches of the house, perpetually hazed with smoke, took on the glossy black sheen of soot-polished wood. Against this darkness, the fire's glow seemed all the warmer, all the more comforting. As night fell, the red-orange light of the flames would create a small sphere of warmth and visibility in the otherwise dark house, gathering the family close together out of necessity. The floor beneath your feet would be packed earth, hardened, over years of use and regularly maintained with fresh clay. Some homes might have rushes or straw scattered over this earthen floor, providing a bit of insulation against the rising cold. These floor coverings were rarely changed completely. New layers would simply be added on top of the old, creating a kind of primitive carpet that, unfortunately, also harbored fleas, mice, and the remains of food scraps dropped during meals. If you were a visitor to this home, you might notice the peculiar smell, not entirely unpleasant but complex and unfamiliar to modern sensibilities. It was a mixture of wood smoke, cooking food, unwashed bodies, the earthy scent of the walls and floor, the animals that often shared the space, and the herbs hung from the rafters to dry. To us it might seem overwhelming. To the medieval family, it was simply the comforting smell of home. As the seasons changed, so did the character of the house. In summer, doors and window coverings would be left open to catch any breeze, and much of the family's life would spill outdoors. In winter, every crack would be stuffed with moss or cloth. The doorway might be covered with a heavy curtain, and the family would gather close to the central fire, their world contracted to this small circle of warmth and light. The outdoor spaces were just as important as the interior. Surrounding the house would be a small plot of land where vegetables grew. Onions, garlic, cabbages, and herbs formed the family's kitchen garden. A simple fence of woven branches protected these precious food sources from wandering animals. Beyond might be a small orchard of fruit trees, carefully tended through generations, or perhaps a small pen for pigs or chickens. Every inch of space had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. This house, so humble by our standards, represented security, continuity, and belonging. It was where life began and ended, where children were born and elders died, where the rituals of daily life created a framework of stability in an uncertain world. The house itself was a constant work in progress, repaired, expanded, and adapted with each passing generation, each addition telling a story of the family's changing fortunes and needs. For the medieval peasant, this wasn't just a structure, it was the physical embodiment of family history, the container of their small but significant place in the world. The house was more than a shelter. It was a living entity that grew and changed alongside its inhabitants, bearing witness to their joys and sorrows, their daily triumphs and struggles, their beginnings and their ends. Where they slept, the bed was, in reality, a pile of straw covered with rough woolen fabrics. The couple slept together with their young children, and sometimes even with smaller animals, such as chickens and pigs, to generate heat during cold nights. Sleep, that most universal of human experiences, was quite different for our medieval ancestors. To understand sleeping arrangements in a peasant household, we must first forget our modern notions of privacy, comfort, and the sanctity of the individual sleeping space. For the medieval family, sleep was a communal activity, a shared necessity that brought everyone close together, especially during the cold months. The bed itself would hardly be recognizable to modern eyes. The most common sleeping arrangement was a simple platform or frame of wood, raised slightly off the ground to avoid drafts and dampness. Upon this frame would be piled whatever soft materials were available, most commonly straw or hay, but sometimes dried leaves, wool fleece if the family owned sheep, or even dried moss gathered from the forest. This mattress of plant material was rarely contained in anything we would recognize as a mattress cover. The materials were simply heaped onto the wooden platform and roughly shaped. Over this makeshift mattress would be laid whatever coverings the family possessed: rough woolen blankets, perhaps a quilt stuffed with more straw or feathers if they were fortunate, or animal skins and furs in colder regions. These bed coverings were precious possessions, often passed down through generations, repeatedly mended and patched as they wore thin. A family might own only one or two such coverings, meaning that body heat was an essential component of staying warm at night. This main bed was typically shared by the parents and youngest children. Older children might sleep on simple pallets on the floor, essentially smaller versions of the main bed, positioned nearby. In the poorest households, the entire family might sleep together on a single large bed platform, bodies arranged for maximum warmth and minimum space. What would strike us most about this sleeping arrangement was its lack of privacy. The concept of private bedrooms was unknown to peasant families. Everyone slept within sight and sound of everyone else, making our modern notion of intimate privacy a foreign concept. This communal sleeping had practical benefits beyond warmth. It allowed parents to monitor young children throughout the night and provided security in times when a nighttime intruder, human or animal, was a real concern. During the coldest winter nights, this communal aspect of sleep extended beyond the human family. Smaller livestock, especially prized chickens, newborn lambs or goats, and sometimes even pigs, might be brought into the house and incorporated into the sleeping arrangements. These animals provided crucial body heat, and their proximity also protected valuable livestock from predators or freezing temperatures. While the thought might seem unhygienic to us, the practical benefits far outweighed concerns about cleanliness in a world where survival through winter was never guaranteed. Pillows, in our soft modern sense, were rare luxuries. More commonly, a small bundle of cloth, a wooden block wrapped in fabric, or simply an arm served to raise the head during sleep. The positioning of the body during sleep was also different. Historical evidence suggests that medieval people often slept in a semi-reclined position, rather than fully horizontal, perhaps, a practical adaptation to the less than comfortable sleeping surfaces available. The family's sleeping position within the house was carefully considered. The bed was typically positioned as far from the door as possible to avoid drafts, but within the warming radius of the central hearth. In some regions, specialized box beds or curtained sleeping nooks built into the walls provided additional protection from drafts and a small measure of privacy. These enclosed sleeping spaces also helped to concentrate body heat and create a microclimate of warmth within the larger, often chilly house. Sleep itself followed different patterns than we observe today. Without artificial lighting, the family's sleep cycle followed the natural rhythm of daylight. In winter, this might mean up to 14 hours of darkness, far too long to sleep continuously. Historical records and research suggest that medieval people often practiced segmented sleep, sleeping for several hours after sunset, then rising for an hour or two of quiet activity around the fire, praying, talking, intimate relations, before returning to sleep until dawn. This biphasic sleep pattern appears to be more natural to human biology than our modern consolidated 8-hour block. Night brought its own sounds and sensations to the medieval sleeper. The house itself would creak and settle. The breathing and occasional snores of family members created a backdrop of comforting human presence. Outside, the night birds called, wolves might howl in the distant forest, and the village watchman might occasionally call the hour. The embers of the fire would cast a dim, flickering light across the ceiling beams, and the scent of wood smoke would permeate everything. Dreams came to medieval sleepers just as they come to us, though their interpretation might differ. Dreams were taken seriously in medieval culture, seen variously as divine messages, portents of the future, or visitations from supernatural beings. A particularly vivid or unusual dream might be shared with the family over breakfast or even brought to the village priest for interpretation. As dawn approached, the house would begin to stir. The woman of the house would typically rise first, rekindling the fire from the overnight embers, beginning the day's first meal, and setting the rhythm for another day of work and life. The warm depression in the straw where bodies had lain all night would gradually cool, awaiting the return of weary bodies when darkness fell once more. This cycle of communal rest, this sharing of warmth and dreams and quiet breathing, created bonds of intimacy that are difficult for us to imagine in our world of private bedrooms and individual sleeping preferences. For the medieval family, Sleep was not just a biological necessity, but a time of enforced togetherness, of shared vulnerability that reinforced the fundamental unit of their society, the family group, surviving together through the darkness. How they dealt with cold. There were no heaters, only the fireplace fire and the proximity of bodies. Clothes were made of thick wool and rarely washed in winter. They used everything they could: cloaks, furs, patched socks. And when the cold intensified, they all slept together in a single corner of the house, wrapped up as best they could. Winter in medieval Europe was an adversary to be respected, feared, and prepared for throughout the year. Without central heating, insulated walls or thermal clothing, surviving the cold months required ingenuity, communal effort, and a certain stoic acceptance of discomfort that is foreign to our temperature-controlled modern lives. The central hearth was the literal and figurative heart of winter survival. Unlike our modern fireplaces built into walls with chimneys to draw away smoke, the medieval hearth was often just a stone-lined fire pit in the center of the home's main room. This central positioning was deliberate. It allowed heat to radiate in all directions, reaching as much of the small house as possible. Maintaining this fire was the most essential task of winter life. The fire was rarely allowed to go out completely. Instead, it was banked with ashes at night to preserve embers that could be rekindled in the morning without the difficult task of starting a new fire from scratch. Fuel for this crucial fire was gathered and prepared throughout the year. While nobles had rights to harvest trees from forests, peasants were usually limited to collecting fallen branches, tree limbs pruned during management of woodland, or windfall, trees that had fallen naturally. In many regions, peat cut from bogs provided an alternative fuel source, as did dried animal dung in areas where wood was scarce. Whatever the fuel, it was carefully dried, stored, and rationed to ensure it would last through the winter months. The fire provided light and heat, but its warmth extended only so far. To capture and preserve this precious heat, medieval families developed strategies that might seem extreme to our modern sensibilities. The most common was simply wearing multiple layers of clothing, even indoors. Undergarments of linen would be covered by tunics, dresses, or leggings of wool, nature's insulating fiber that retains warmth even when damp. Over these would go whatever additional garments the family possessed. Perhaps a fur-lined cloak, a sheepskin vest, or a mantle that could be wrapped around the shoulders. Particularly valued were items made of fur, nature's perfect insulation. While wealthy nobles might display elaborate furs from exotic animals, peasants made use of the pelts of local creatures: rabbits, foxes, badgers, and other small mammals. These might be sewn together to create warm linings for cloaks or simple blankets. Nothing was wasted. Even the smallest scraps of fur or cloth could be used to line mittens or stuff into shoes for extra warmth. Hats were essential, as medieval people well understood that much body heat is lost through the head. Simple wool caps might be worn day and night during the coldest months. Women typically covered their hair with linen wimples and veils, not just for modesty, but for practical warmth as well. The extremities, hands and feet, were particularly vulnerable to cold. Mittens, rather than gloves with separate fingers, were preferred for their superior warmth. Foot coverings consisted of leather or cloth shoes, supplemented with thick wool socks or foot wrappings. In some regions, simple wooden pattern clogs might be worn over regular shoes to elevate the foot above cold, wet ground. Despite these protections, chilblains, painful inflammation of small blood vessels in the skin due to cold, and frostbite were common winter afflictions. Various folk remedies, ointments of animal fat, herbal compresses, and warming poultices, were applied to affected areas with varying degrees of effectiveness. The cold didn't only affect people, it threatened the survival of the precious. Livestock as well. Smaller animals like chickens might be brought into the house during the coldest periods. Larger livestock, cows, oxen, sheep, would be housed in attached byres or nearby barns. The body heat of these animals was significant, and in some house designs, the animal quarters were purposely positioned so that their warmth would transfer to the human living space through a shared wall. Windows, those vulnerable points in any shelter, were few in peasant homes for good reason. Any openings would be covered with oiled cloth, thin animal membranes or wooden shutters at night to block drafts. Doors might be hung with heavy cloth curtains to create an airlock-like barrier against cold air when opened. Despite all these measures, the interior of a medieval house during winter would feel uncomfortably cold to modern visitors. Temperatures just a few feet away from the fire might be only a few degrees above the outside temperature. This reality shaped behavior. Family members would stay close to the hearth, working on indoor tasks that could be done while seated, near the warmth. Essential work like cooking, mending, wood carving, or spinning could all be accomplished in this tight circle of relative comfort. At night, the strategy was simple: consolidate body heat. Family members would sleep close together, often sharing not just the same bed but the same blankets, creating a pocket of shared warmth. Extra clothing might be piled on top of bedding for added insulation. Stories tell of particularly cold nights when families would sleep in a circle around the banked fire, feet pointing toward the dying embers like spokes on a wheel. Clever use was made of heated objects to provide targeted warmth. Stones or bricks placed near the fire during the day would be wrapped in cloth and taken to bed at night, providing hours of gentle heat as they slowly cooled. In more affluent households, metal warming pans filled with hot embers might be passed between the sheets before bedtime to take the worst chill off the bedding. Diet changed with the season as well, with winter meals tending toward higher calorie foods that generated internal warmth. Soups and pottages, thick stews, were staples, providing not just nutrition, but the warming effect of hot food in the stomach. Spices like ginger, pepper, and cinnamon were valued not just for flavor, but for their warming properties. Alcoholic beverages, ale, beer, and in some regions wine or mead, were consumed not just for their intoxicating effects, but for the immediate sensation of warmth they provided. Though in reality, alcohol ultimately lowers body temperature by increasing blood flow to the skin. Community was perhaps the most important defense against winter's bite. Work that required being outdoors for extended periods might be done collectively, allowing people to take turns warming themselves while others continued the task. The elderly or infirm, particularly vulnerable to cold, would be looked after by neighbors and family. Visiting neighboring homes provided not just social interaction, but shared warmth as more bodies gathered around a single fire. Through these methods, some clever, some merely endured, medieval people survived winter. After winter, the cold was not conquered, but accommodated, respected, and withstood through preparation, adaptation, and communal effort. There was a certain wisdom in this approach, an acceptance of nature's rhythms that perhaps we have lost in our climate-controlled modernity, where winter is something we observe through windows rather than negotiate with for survival. Food in the peasant home food was simple: dark bread, soups made from vegetables, oats, and occasionally a piece of salted meat. Food was cooked in iron pots hung over the fire. Utensils were made of wood. And the flavor, seasoning was scarce. Salt and local herbs were enough. The kitchen of a medieval peasant was nothing like our modern cooking spaces. There were no countertops, no refrigerators, no neatly organized spice racks. Instead, the entire house served as kitchen, with the central hearth as the only cooking facility. Yet from this simple setup came the sustenance that powered the agricultural workforce that fed all of medieval society. Bread was quite literally the staff of life for the medieval peasant, forming the foundation of almost every meal. Unlike the soft white breads we're familiar with today, medieval bread was typically dense, dark, and made from whatever grains were available, often rye or barley rather than wheat, which was more expensive and sometimes reserved for paying rents to landlords. The process of making bread was labor-intensive and occupied a significant portion of a woman's working week. First, grain had to be ground into flour. Wealthier villages might have access to a mill, where grain could be ground between large stones powered by water or wind, but this service required payment, often a portion of the flour itself. Many families would grind smaller amounts at home using a quern, a simple hand mill consisting of two circular stones, the upper one fitted with a handle for turning against the lower. The resulting flour was coarser than modern varieties still, containing bits of husk and sometimes small pebbles that could wear down teeth over a lifetime. This flour would be mixed with water, salt if available, and a sourdough starter saved from the previous batch to create a dense dough. Yeast as we know it wasn't used. Instead, fermentation was achieved through the wild yeasts captured in the sourdough starter. Kneading this heavy dough was physically demanding work. The dough would then be formed into loaves and left to rise, though medieval bread would rise much less than modern loaves due to the heavier flour and wilder fermentation. In villages with a communal oven, women would mark their loaves with distinctive patterns to identify their family's bread after baking. In homes without access to an oven, bread might be baked in covered clay pots placed in the embers of the fire or on flat stones placed near the flames, creating a simple flatbread. The resulting loaf was far removed from our modern bread, dense, chewy, with a thick crust and a texture that required serious chewing. But it was filling, relatively long-lasting, and could be carried to the fields as a midday meal. Bread that had grown stale wasn't wasted. It would be broken up into pottage or soup to soften, used as a trencher, a plate made of bread, for serving other foods, or in desperate times, softened with water or ale to extend its usefulness. After bread, the most common daily food was pottage, a thick soup or stew that would simmer over the fire for hours, sometimes all day. This was typically a vegetable-based dish, made with whatever was seasonally available from the garden plot. Onions, garlic, cabbages, leeks, turnips, carrots, and peas were common ingredients, supplemented with herbs for flavor. To this vegetable base might be added grains like barley, oats, or rye to create a thicker, more filling meal. On special occasions, or in more prosperous times, pottage might contain small amounts of meat, more often preserved meat like salt pork or bacon, which could be stored long-term rather than fresh meat. The bones left from rare meat occasions would be cracked to extract the marrow and then boiled repeatedly to extract every bit of flavor and nutrition. This ever-simmering pot had practical advantages beyond nutrition. Family members could eat when hungry, rather than requiring a formal meal to be prepared, and the constant cooking would effectively sterilize ingredients that might be slightly past their prime, important in a world without refrigeration. Dairy. Products were an important part of the medieval diet when available. Most peasant families tried to keep at least one cow or several goats or sheep for milk. Fresh milk itself was consumed less frequently than its preserved forms, primarily cheese and butter, which could be stored for winter use. Making cheese was a skilled process that transformed highly perishable milk into a food that could last months. The milk would be set with rennet, an enzyme from calf stomachs, to separate the curds from the whey. The curds would then be drained, salted, and pressed into molds to create cheeses of varying hardness and flavor. Even the whey, the liquid remaining after curd formation, wouldn't be wasted but used as a nutritious drink or cooking liquid. Butter was made by churning cream in a wooden butter churn, a task often assigned to children. The resulting butter might be salted heavily for preservation and stored in cool locations like cellars or springhouses. Both cheese and butter provided crucial fat and protein to supplement the largely carbohydrate-based diet. Eggs from chickens or other fowl were another valuable protein source. Unlike meat, eggs could be obtained without killing the animal that produced them, making them a renewable resource. They might be eaten on their own, used in cooking, or preserved by various methods, including pickling in vinegar or salt water. Fruits were consumed seasonally and according to what grew locally. Apples, pears, plums, and berries might be eaten fresh in season or dried for winter use. Nuts gathered from woodlands, walnuts, hazelnuts, chestnuts, provided protein and fats that were otherwise scarce in the peasant diet. Honey was the primary sweetener, though it was precious and used sparingly. Beekeeping was practiced in Cistercienses, many communities with hives often made from upturned straw baskets called skeps. Honey was valued not just for sweetening, but for its medicinal properties and for making mead, an alcoholic beverage created by fermenting honey with water. The beverage of daily life wasn't water, which could be unsafe to drink, but rather ale or beer, even for children. This wasn't the high-alcohol beverage we think of today, but a weaker, nutrient-rich drink sometimes called small beer. The fermentation process killed harmful bacteria making it safer than untreated water, and the grain provided additional calories and B vitamins. The brewing of this essential beverage was typically women's work, done regularly as part of household production. Wine was produced in regions with suitable climates, but was more commonly consumed by the wealthy. Peasants in wine-producing regions might drink a thin, sour wine made from the second or third pressing of grapes, after the best juice had been taken for finer wines. Seasonings were simple, but important for making repetitive foods palatable. Salt was essential not just for flavoring, but for preserving food. Some might be obtained by boiling seawater in coastal areas, but inland it had to be purchased, making it a valuable commodity. Herbs grown in the garden or gathered from the wild provided both flavor and medicinal properties. Sage, rosemary, thyme, mint, and many others were used according to local availability. Garlic and onions featured prominently in medieval cooking, adding flavor to otherwise bland dishes and providing health benefits recognized even then. Other flavorings might include vinegar, made from fermenting excess fruit or verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes or crab apples, used much like lemon juice in modern cooking. Expensive imported spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg were far beyond the means of most peasants, who would experience these exotic flavors only on the rarest of special occasions, if ever. The rhythm of meals followed the natural day and the agricultural seasons. The main meal was typically eaten in the middle of the day, providing energy for afternoon work, with lighter food in the morning and evening. Winter diets were more limited, relying heavily on stored foods, while spring might bring the hungry gap when stored foods were running low, but new crops were not yet ready for harvest. Food was consumed from simple wooden bowls or trenchers, flat pieces of stale bread or sometimes wood that served as plates. Spoons were the primary utensil, typically made of wood, with knives used for cutting. Forks were unknown. Food was conveyed to the mouth with the fingers or speared with the point of a knife. Drinking vessels might be simple wooden cups, pottery mugs, or leather vessels called jacks. The medieval approach to food was fundamentally practical. Waste was virtually non-existent, as every edible part of plants and animals was utilized in some form. What couldn't be consumed by humans might feed livestock or be composted to enrich the garden soil. This closed-loop system, born of necessity, created a sustainable food cycle that we might consider remarkably green by modern standards. Famine was always a looming threat, particularly after poor harvests or during times of conflict. Communities developed various coping strategies, including knowledge of famine foods, plants not normally eaten but that could sustain life in desperate times. These might include various nuts, bark flowers, and wild plants normally considered too bitter or unpalatable for regular consumption. Despite its challenges and limitations, this food system sustained countless generations through the medieval period. The knowledge of how to grow, process, preserve, and prepare food from limited ingredients was passed down from mother to daughter, father to son, creating an unbroken chain of culinary tradition that formed the foundation of much of our modern European food culture. Work inside the house. While men went out to work in the field, women took care of the house, children, and small animals. Spinning wool, mending clothes, grinding grain, tending the garden. All this was part of the routine. There was no rest, but there was also no hurry. Life followed the rhythm of the sun and the seasons. The interior of a medieval peasant's home was not just a place of shelter and rest. It was a busy workshop where essential production and processing took place throughout the year. While men typically worked the fields, women managed this domestic industry. Though the division was never absolute, men might work indoors during winter or bad weather, and women would help with harvesting and other field work during busy seasons. Textile production was perhaps the most constant of indoor occupations, particularly for women. The process began with raw materials, wool from sheep, flax from the fields, that had to be transformed through many labor-intensive steps into usable cloth. For wool, this meant first sorting and cleaning the fleece, removing debris and the worst of the lanolin, sheep oil. Next came carding, using paddles covered with metal teeth to straighten and align the fibers, preparing them for spinning. The spinning itself was done with a drop spindle, a weighted stick that would be set spinning while the spinner carefully drew out and twisted the fibers to create thread. The spinning wheel, which would later revolutionize textile production, was only beginning to appear in Europe by the late medieval period. A skilled spinner with a drop spindle could produce thread continuously, the motion becoming so automatic that other tasks could be managed simultaneously, watching children, stirring pots, or participating in conversation. Once enough thread was produced, it might be dyed using plant materials, wode for blue, madder for red, weld for yellow, and various barks, lichens, and berries for other colors. Then came the complex process of setting up a loom for weaving. The simplest homes might have only a backstrap loom, a portable arrangement where one end of the warp threads is attached to a fixed point and the other to a belt around the weaver's waist. More established households might have an upright, warp-weighted loom or a horizontal loom that took up significant space in the house. Weaving was rhythmic, demanding work requiring both strength and precision. The finished cloth would be sturdy but rough by modern standards. Further processing, fulling, beating the cloth in water to thicken it, smoothing and sometimes felting would be needed to create the final textile. This homespun cloth was then transformed into garments, bedding, sacks, and all the other textile needs of the household. Sewing was done by hand, using bone, wood, or metal needles with thread made from linen or wool. Patterns were handed down through generations, with garments designed for practicality and maximum use of the precious fabric. Nothing was wasted. Scraps would be saved for patches, quilting, or stuffing. Clothing maintenance was an ongoing task. Without modern detergents or washing machines, cleaning clothes was difficult, especially in winter. Garments might be beaten, brushed, and aired rather than fully washed. When washing was necessary, it involved labor-intensive processes using lye soap, made from ash and animal fat, beating the garments on rocks in flowing water, and long drying times. Consequently, outer garments were washed infrequently, though linen undergarments, which could be boiled, were changed and cleaned more regularly. A second major category of indoor work centered around food processing and preservation. Without refrigeration, harvested foods had to be quickly preserved for future use. This took multiple forms: drying, herbs, some fruits, and occasionally strips of meat would be hung from rafters to dry. Smoking, particularly for meat and fish, using the smoke from the central fire. Salting, layers of salt would draw moisture from foods and create an environment hostile to bacteria. Pickling using vinegar or brine. And fermentation, transforming foods through controlled microbial action, as in making cheese or sauerkraut. These preservation methods required intimate knowledge passed down through generations, knowing exactly how much salt was needed, recognizing when fermentation had reached the right stage, understanding how to adjust processes for different weather conditions. This was not just cooking but food science, developed through centuries of trial and error. Daily food preparation itself consumed significant time. Grains had to be ground, a physically demanding process using a quernstone before the widespread availability of water or windmills. Vegetables needed cleaning and chopping, often with just a simple knife on a wooden surface. Cooking over an open hearth required constant attention to maintain proper heat, moving pots closer to or further from the flames, banking or stoking the fire as needed. Water had to be fetched, typically from a village well or nearby stream, and carried home in wooden buckets or pottery vessels, a task often assigned to children old enough to manage the weight. This water served for cooking, minimal cleaning, and occasional washing, though much less water was used daily than in modern households. Home maintenance constituted another category of indoor work. The earth floor needed regular attention, being sprinkled with water and tamped down to prevent it from becoming too dusty or uneven. Walls required patching as the daub cracked or eroded, a task typically done with fresh clay mixed with straw. The thatched roof needed regular inspection and repair, with worn or rotting sections replaced before they could allow leaks. The central hearth required particularly careful maintenance. Ashes had to be cleared regularly, but not completely. Some would be saved for making lye, used in soap making and cleaning, while others would be used to bank the fire at night, preserving embers for morning. The chimneyless design meant that soot accumulated on walls and rafters, occasionally requiring scraping to prevent it from falling into food. Parasites were a constant concern in these close quarters. Bedding needed to be aired and beaten to combat fleas and other insects. Herbs with insect-repelling properties, like lavender, pennyroyal, or tansy, would be strewn about the house or hung in bunches from the rafters, providing both practical protection and a pleasant scent to counter less appealing household odors. Tool maintenance filled many evening hours, especially in winter. Wooden handles for agricultural implements would be carved or repaired, metal parts cleaned of rust and sharpened, baskets and other woven containers mended or created anew. These tasks were often done by firelight after dark, when fieldwork was impossible. Childcare wove through all these activities. Unlike our modern compartmentalized approach to raising children, medieval children were integrated into the working household from their earliest days. Infants might be swaddled and placed in simple cradles near the mother as she worked, or carried in slings. As soon as they could toddle, children would be assigned simple tasks, fetching items, sorting beans, shooing away chickens, that gradually increased in complexity as they aged. Formal education was rare, but vocational. Training was constant. Girls would learn the domestic arts by watching and helping their mothers and other female relatives, gradually taking on more responsibility until they mastered the complex skills needed to manage a household. Boys similarly learned from their fathers, though they might also be sent to learn specific crafts as apprentices if the family could arrange it. Beyond these practical tasks lay the realm of home health care. The woman of the house was typically the primary healer for the family, drawing on knowledge of medicinal herbs and traditional remedies passed down through generations. Many of the same plants grown for cooking, sage, rosemary, garlic, also served medicinal purposes. Others were grown specifically for their healing properties, creating a kitchen garden that doubled as a primitive pharmacy. Common remedies might include poultices of herbs for wounds or skin conditions, teas and infusions for internal ailments, and salves made from beeswax and various plant oils. While we might dismiss many medieval remedies as ineffective from our modern perspective, recent research has confirmed the antimicrobial properties of many traditional herbs, suggesting that some treatments had real efficacy. The production of essential household items constituted yet another category of indoor work. Candles, crucial for light during winter's long darkness, were made from tallow, animal fat, or, more rarely, beeswax. The process involved repeatedly dipping wicks into melted fat until they reached the desired thickness, a slow, methodical task, often done in batches to maximize fuel usage. Soap making was a less frequent but essential activity, typically done outdoors due to the caustic ingredients. Wood ash saved from the fire would be leached with water to create lye, which was then combined with rendered animal fat and boiled, to create a soft soap used for cleaning bodies, hair, and occasionally clothing. Baskets, essential for countless household uses from storage to transport, were woven from willing materials like reeds, straw, or thin wooden splints. This craft, practiced during quiet evenings or rainy days, transformed ubiquitous natural materials into practical tools that might last for years with proper care. Even seemingly simple items like brooms required home production. Different types served different purposes. Softer brooms for indoor sweeping might be made from bundled grasses, while sturdier outdoor versions could use stiffer materials like birch twigs tied to a wooden handle. The rhythm of all this work followed natural cycles daily as light waxed and waned, weekly, with certain tasks traditionally assigned to specific days, seasonally as the availability of materials and the pressing needs of agriculture shifted the focus of household labor, and yearly, with major cleaning and maintenance, often time to coincide with religious festivals that marked the calendar. Spring brought its own particular indoor tasks. Seeds carefully saved from previous harvests would be sorted and prepared for planting. Summer might see less activity inside, as the pressing demands of fieldwork drew everyone outdoors, but food preservation would begin as the first garden crops matured. Autumn was the busiest season for food processing as the main harvests came in and needed to be preserved before spoiling. Winter, when agricultural work slowed, became the time for textile work, tool repair, and crafts that could be done by firelight. For all its ceaseless demands, this indoor work had a steady, almost meditative quality. Many tasks were repetitive, allowing the mind to wander or engage in conversation, singing, or storytelling while hands remained busy. Work was rarely rushed. There was simply too much of it to ever be finished, so it proceeded at a sustainable pace, punctuated by brief periods of rest or shifts to less demanding tasks when fatigue set in. Social aspects of work were significant. Many tasks that might be done more efficiently alone were instead structured as group activities, several women gathering to spin together, or neighboring families joining forces for major food preservation efforts. These work gatherings served as important opportunities for community bonding, information exchange, and the transmission of cultural knowledge through stories and songs shared during work. Religious observance was woven into this work through prayers said at particular times of day, through the crafting of items needed for religious festivals, and through the observation of holy days when certain types of work were prohibited. Faith provided both structure for daily work and meaning for the labor itself. Work well done could be seen as honoring God and fulfilling one's place in the divine order. The medieval home, far from being merely a place to rest between bouts of field labor, was a complex center of production, processing, education, healthcare, and social life. The work done within its walls was essential, not just for daily survival, but for the continuity of family and community across generations. In many ways, it represented an integrated way of living and working that our modern, compartmentalized existence has lost. A wholeness of life where labor, learning, spirituality, and community were not separate realms, but aspects of a single, coherent existence centered in the humble space called home. Hygiene and customs. There was no bathroom. A bucket in the corner of the house served as a toilet. Baths were rare, especially in winter. Popular belief said that water and cold could cause illness. Therefore, a damp cloth on the face and hands was the maximum of daily hygiene. To understand medieval hygiene, we must first set aside our modern assumptions. In a world without running water, flush toilets, or widely accepted germ theory, cleanliness took different forms and served different purposes than it does today. This doesn't mean, as is sometimes claimed, that medieval people were indifferent to cleanliness. Rather, they approached it with different priorities and methods shaped by their understanding of health, available resources, and practical realities. Let's begin with the matter of bodily waste, a universal human concern regardless of era. Unlike the completely indoor plumbing we take for granted, medieval waste management varied widely depending on location, season, and household resources. For many peasant families, the simplest solution was an outdoor privy, a small structure built over a pit dug in the ground, located away from the house and water sources. These might be shared between several households, particularly in village settings. During inclement weather, nighttime, or illness, an indoor solution became necessary. This typically took the form of a chamber pot, a specialized vessel with a wide rim and sometimes a handle, made of pottery or occasionally metal for wealthy households. This would be used as needed and emptied outside, into the privy pit or onto the household midden waste pile, where it would eventually break down into compost for the fields. In the simplest dwellings, a designated corner might serve for nighttime, necessities with straw or rushes to absorb waste, which would be removed in the morning. While obviously aromatic by our standards, the strong smell of wood smoke that permeated everything in these chimneyless houses would have masked many odors. For larger settlements, more sophisticated solutions existed. Some medieval towns had primitive sewage systems, channels running down the middle of streets that would carry waste away, ideally to a river. Monasteries often had quite advanced systems with flowing water to carry waste from communal latrines. Some castles featured garderobes, primitive toilets built into the walls, essentially stone seats over openings that dropped waste to the outside of the building or into moats. The disposal of household waste followed practical patterns. Food, Scraps might go to livestock. Pigs in particular were valued for their ability to convert kitchen waste into protein. Other organic waste would be added to the midden heap, where it would decompose into fertilizer for future use in the fields or garden. Even human waste, once properly composted, would eventually return to the agricultural fields, a recycling system born of necessity that maintained soil fertility across generations. Personal bodily cleaning followed different patterns than we're familiar with today. The full immersion bath, so central to our modern hygiene, was a relatively rare occurrence for most medieval peasants. This wasn't primarily due to any taboo against bathing, as is sometimes claimed, but rather the practical difficulties involved. Heating sufficient water required significant fuel and time, and proper bathing vessels were not commonplace in peasant households. Instead, personal cleaning typically focused on the visible and socially important parts of the body: hands, face, and sometimes feet. A basin of water, a cloth, and perhaps some soap made from animal fat and wood ash would be used for these targeted ablutions. Hair washing was less frequent, perhaps monthly rather than weekly, again due to the practical challenges involved. This doesn't mean medieval people were comfortable with filth. Historical records show considerable concern for cleanliness, particularly before religious observations or social gatherings. What differed was the method and frequency, shaped by different understanding of health, different resources, and different priorities. Dental hygiene, so central to modern health practices, took simpler forms. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist, but tooth cleaning tools did. Chew sticks, twigs with frayed ends used to scrub the teeth, have been used across many cultures for thousands of years. Some medieval texts recommend rubbing teeth with cloth or rinsing with various herbal preparations. Dental issues were, nevertheless, common, exacerbated by the coarse bread that wore down tooth enamel and introduced grit that damaged teeth over time. Hand washing was perhaps the most frequent hygiene practice, particularly before eating, as food was often taken directly with the fingers and after particularly dirty tasks. This practice had both social and practical dimensions, and while germ theory was unknown, the visible removal of dirt was valued both for appearances and for what we would now recognize as legitimate health benefits. The management of parasites, lice, fleas, and other unwelcome companions required constant attention. Regular combing with fine-toothed combs helped control head lice. Aromatic herbs strewn about the house or worn in pouches were believed to repel insects, some with actual efficacy. Clothing might be boiled or, in winter, left outside in freezing temperatures to kill parasites. For most peasants, the closest experience to our modern concept of bathing might come in summer, when streams and rivers provided an opportunity for more complete washing. These occasions might combine practical hygiene with relief from heat and social recreation, as community members gathered at suitable swimming spots. Public bathhouses did exist in medieval Europe, particularly in towns and cities, continuing a tradition from the Roman period. However, these became less common in the later medieval period, particularly after the Black Death sparked fears about disease transmission through shared water. The link between certain hygiene practices and health was recognized if incompletely understood. Hand washing was known to be important, even if the specific mechanism of germ transmission was not yet discovered. The association of foul smells with disease, the miasma theory, led to practices that, while based on incomplete understanding, sometimes had beneficial effects, such as keeping waste away from living spaces and water sources. Aromatics played an important role in medieval hygiene concepts. Strong-smelling herbs like lavender, rosemary, and mint were believed to protect against disease by countering miasmas. These would be strewn on floors, hung in bunches from rafters, or carried in small pouches known as pomanders. While their disease-fighting capability was misconceived, many such herbs do have legitimate antimicrobial properties, and certainly would have improved the olfactory environment of the home. Clothing maintenance represented another aspect of hygiene. While full washing of garments was infrequent, especially for outer clothing made of wool, which is difficult to clean and dry, other methods were employed to maintain cleanliness. Airing clothes outdoors, particularly on sunny, breezy days, helped remove odors. Brushing removed surface dirt. Spot cleaning addressed specific stains. Linen undergarments, which could be boiled without damage, were changed and washed more frequently than outer garments, providing a layer of relatively clean fabric against the skin. Seasonal variations strongly affected hygiene practices. Summer allowed for more frequent washing of bodies and clothes, with warm temperatures facilitating drying. Winter necessarily saw a reduction in water-based cleaning, with greater reliance on dry methods and the use of perfumes and aromatics to mask inevitable odors. The medieval approach to hygiene, while different from our own, represented a practical adaptation to available resources and understanding. Many practices that seem inadequate by modern standards were quite reasonable within their context. Without running water, without understanding of microorganisms, without easy access to cleaning products, medieval people nevertheless developed systems for managing waste, maintaining personal cleanliness as defined by their culture, and creating livable domestic environments. It's worth noting that our modern standards of daily showering, constant laundering, and perpetual deodorizing are themselves historically anomalous, products of very recent technological and cultural developments, rather than universal human norms. The medieval approach to hygiene stands not as a failed version of our current practices, but as a different system altogether, one adapted to its own time and circumstances, with its own internal logic and effectiveness. Objects and furniture, everything, was handmade. Benches, spoons, baskets, fabrics. The house had few pieces of furniture, a simple table, some benches, a shelf for clay pots. But each object told a story and lasted for years, sometimes generations. The material world of the medieval peasant was sparse by our standards, but rich in other ways. Each object in the home represented significant investment of time and skill, often made by the family members themselves, or bartered from neighbors with specialized craft abilities. Unlike our disposable economy, these items were built to last, repaired repeatedly, and passed down through generations. The central piece of furniture in most homes was the table, not the fixed dining table we might imagine, but often a more flexible arrangement of boards laid across trestles. This allowed the table to be dismantled when not in use, freeing precious floor space for other activities. The trestle table might be brought out for meals, then taken down afterward, with the boards perhaps serving other purposes when not needed as a table. Seating came in several simple forms. Benches, essentially long boards supported by legs at either end, provided efficient seating for multiple people while using minimal materials. Three-legged stools, more stable than four-legged designs on uneven floors, might serve as individual seats, particularly for tasks requiring frequent movement like milking. The simplest seating might be mere logs, split in half to provide a flat surface. Chairs with backs were relatively rare in peasant homes, sometimes reserved for the head of the household or elderly family members who needed the support. Storage solutions were critical in the small space. A large wooden chest, often the most substantial piece of furniture in the home, would contain the family's most valuable possessions, perhaps special clothing worn only for religious festivals, important documents for those few who possessed them, small heirlooms or seeds saved for the next planting. This chest might also serve as a bench when closed, providing dual functionality. Open shelving, simple boards supported by pegs driven into the wall, would hold everyday pottery and wooden vessels. Hanging storage was equally important. Rafters would be studded with pegs or hooks, from which hung bundles of drying herbs, onions and garlic on strings, cured meats, and tools that needed to be kept dry and accessible. For frequent cooks, the batterie de cuisine would be simple but effective. A large iron cauldron was often a family's most valuable metal possession, used for everything from cooking pottage to heating water for washing. These durable vessels could last for generations and might represent a significant investment for the family. Smaller cooking pots of iron or pottery, long-handled spoons for stirring, and perhaps a metal griddle for cooking flat breads completed the essential cooking implements. Knives were multifunction tools rather than dedicated kitchen implements. A personal knife would be used for eating, food preparation, simple wood carving, and countless other daily tasks. These were often carried on the person rather than stored in a specific kitchen location. Tableware was straightforward. Wooden bowls, durable, relatively easy to clean and made from locally available materials, served for most foods. These would be crafted using simple tools, starting with a section of log that would be hollowed out using special curved adzes, then smoothed with scrapers. With use, these bowls would develop a natural patina from food oils, eventually gaining a somewhat water-resistant finish through years of handling. Spoons, also of wood, were the primary eating utensil. Each family member might have their own, sometimes carved with identifying marks or decorative elements. These personal spoons might be carried in pouches when traveling or attending feasts outside the home. Forks were unknown in peasant households. Foods were either eaten with spoons, stabbed with knife points, or taken with the fingers. Drinking vessels varied by region and household means. Simple cups of turned wood served in many homes. Pottery mugs, occasionally glazed on the interior to reduce leakage, were fairly common. In some regions, cups made of tightly woven basketry, sealed with pine pitch, could hold liquids surprisingly well. Leather vessels, hard leather cups or softer leather bottles, served both for drinking and for carrying liquids while working in the fields. Bedding, beyond the simple mattress stuffing mentioned earlier, included whatever blankets, quilts, or furs the family possessed. Pillows, as we know them, were uncommon. A rolled cloak or small sack stuffed with straw might serve to elevate the head. In better-equipped households, bed curtains hung from the ceiling might provide some insulation and privacy, creating a tent-like sleeping space within the larger room. Lighting, beyond the central fire, came from simple lamps, shallow dishes, of pottery or metal filled with oil, often fish oil or animal fat, with a floating wick of twisted plant fibers. These produced modest light and considerable smoke. Rushlights, dried reeds soaked in fat, provided inexpensive temporary illumination when needed. Candles, particularly those made from beeswax rather than tallow, were relatively precious items, often reserved for special occasions or specific tasks requiring better light. Textile tools occupied important space in the home. The distaff and spindle for spinning fibers into thread hung ready for use in spare moments. A loom, if the family possessed one, might dominate a section of the house during the weaving season. Baskets for holding fibers, bobbins wound with finished thread, and simple implements for carding wool would be arranged near good light, ready for the constant work of textile production. For personal grooming, a small metal mirror might be the family's only concession to vanity, and even this would be a valued possession, perhaps brought out only for special occasions. Combs of wood, bone, or horn were essential tools for detangling hair and removing lice. Simple brushes made from bundled plant fibers served for cleaning. Children's toys were typically homemade, and often miniature versions of adult tools. Small wooden swords, rough dolls made from twisted straw or scraps of cloth, tiny clay pots, or simple wooden animals. These toys served not just for play but as training for adult roles, allowing children to imitate and gradually master the skills they would need. Religious items held special places in even the simplest homes. A small cross, perhaps carved from wood, might hang on the wall. A sprig of palm saved from Palm Sunday services would be displayed as protection against lightning and storms. In some regions, a bowl of holy water from the church would be kept near the door for blessing oneself when entering or leaving. Tools for specific crafts would be arranged in dedicated areas if space allowed. Woodworking implements, axes, adzes, draw knives, and planes would be kept carefully sharpened and oiled to prevent rust. Metalworking, pottery, or other specialized crafts practiced by the family would each have their collection of purpose-specific tools, often handmade, and adapted to the individual worker. The hearth itself featured specialized equipment, an iron fire poker for managing the flames, perhaps a hook and chain system, called a chimney crane, for suspending pots at the proper height above the fire, and a wooden bellows for quickly increasing heat when needed, would all be positioned for easy use. Agricultural tools, though primarily used outdoors, might be stored inside during winter or when not in use. Smaller implements like sickles, flails for threshing grain, or scythes would hang from wall pegs, while larger items might rest against walls or even from ceiling beams when space was at a premium. What strikes the modern observer about this material world is its fundamentally different relationship to consumption. Nearly every object was made locally, often by its users, from materials sourced within walking distance. Each item represented significant investment of time and had a clear purpose. The concept of disposability would have been alien. Even broken items would be repaired repeatedly or repurposed when they could no longer serve their original function. This approach created a different aesthetic sense as well. Objects gained beauty not primarily from decoration, though simple carved or painted designs might adorn special items, but from the patina of use that developed over time. A wooden spoon, darkened and polished by thousands of meals and countless handlings, possessed a kind of beauty derived from its utility and history rather than unnecessary ornamentation. The medieval peasant's material world was thus neither primitive nor unsophisticated, but rather finely adapted to available resources, technical capabilities, and practical needs. Each object represented not just its function, but embodied knowledge, skill, and tradition passed down through generations. In a world where little was written, these everyday items themselves became a kind of text, recording and transmitting cultural knowledge through their form and function. Life in community. Despite the hard life, peasants lived in community. They helped each other during harvest, house building, religious celebrations. Children ran freely between houses, learning from an early age the importance of land and collective work. To understand medieval peasant life, we must recognize that the individual household, for all its importance, was just one cell in the larger organism of the village community. This communal dimension touched every aspect of life, creating systems of mutual aid, shared labor, collective decision-making, and social bonding that made survival possible in a challenging world. The much romanticized concept of "it takes" a village was, for medieval people, not a charming saying but a literal description of how life functioned. The most visible manifestation of this communal approach was the open field system of agriculture practiced in much of medieval Europe. Rather than each family farming a separate enclosed plot, the arable land surrounding a village was typically divided into large open fields, which were further subdivided into strips. Each family would work several strips scattered throughout these fields rather than a single consolidated holding. This seemingly inefficient arrangement actually represented a sophisticated risk management system. By having strips in different fields with varying soil conditions and exposure, families spread their risk. If one area flooded or suffered from pests, others might still yield a harvest. The scattered strips also ensured that both prime land and less desirable plots were distributed among all villagers, preventing dangerous inequalities in food security. Working these fields required coordination and collective labor. The village would decide together when to plow, sow, and harvest. With families working side by side in the fields, major agricultural tasks were synchronized so that everyone planted and harvested at roughly the same time, allowing for efficient use of shared resources like draft animals, which not every family would own individually. The most labor-intensive periods, particularly harvest, would see the entire community mobilized, with everyone from children to elders contributing according to their abilities. This collective approach ensured that crops were brought in quickly before weather could damage them. Payment for this labor might come in the form of a harvest feast provided by the landowner, a share of the crop, or reciprocal help when needed. Beyond the cultivated fields lay other communal resources. The village commons, areas of permanent pasture, provided grazing for livestock owned by villagers. Nearby woodlands offered timber for building, branches for firewood, foraged foods like nuts and berries, and hunting opportunities. Access to these resources was governed by complex customary rites, often managed by the village as a whole through a council of elders or householders. The shared nature of these resources required careful management to prevent overuse. Systems evolved to limit the number of animals each household could graze on the commons, to regulate when wood could be gathered, and to allocate other shared resources. These medieval systems of commons management were often sophisticated and sustainable, allowing communities to use the same resources for generations without depleting them. The village church served as more than just a religious center. It was the primary community building, used for meetings, celebrations, shelter during disasters, and sometimes even storage of the village grain supply. The parish priest might serve as record keeper, mediator of disputes, and link to the broader world of knowledge and authority beyond the village. The religious calendar structured community life, with saints' days and church festivals providing opportunities for rest from labor, communal celebration, and reinforcement of social bonds. Many of these celebrations combined Christian observances with older seasonal festivals related to agricultural cycles. May Day, Midsummer, Harvest Home, and Midwinter festivities created a rhythm of community gatherings throughout the year. These festivals served important social and psychological functions beyond their religious significance. They provided breaks from the relentless work of survival, opportunities for courtship among young people, venues for resolving tensions through ritualized competitions or symbolic role reversals, and moments of abundance in a life that often featured scarcity. The shared experience of preparation, celebration, and cleanup strengthened community bonds. The physical arrangement of the village itself reflected and reinforced this communal ethos. Houses typically clustered closely together, sometimes sharing walls with small private garden plots behind them and the communal fields beyond. This density facilitated the sharing of resources like wells, ovens, or mills, and created natural gathering spaces where news could be exchanged, children supervised collectively, and informal governance occur. Village life had its own information networks. Without newspapers, radio, or internet, information traveled by word of mouth. The village well or washing place, typically used by women, served as information hubs where news, concerns, and gossip were exchanged during the course of daily work. Similarly, men might share information while working together in the fields or gathering in the evening after the day's labor. Economic life extended beyond individual households through various sharing and exchange mechanisms. Few peasant families were completely self-sufficient. Instead, networks of barter, lending, and mutual aid filled gaps in each household's production. A family might exchange eggs for a neighbor's blacksmithing skills, borrow a plow ox with the understanding that the favor would be returned, or contribute labor to a community project with the expectation of receiving help when needed. These exchanges weren't tracked with the precision of modern economic transactions, but operated within a general understanding of reciprocity and fairness. Families that consistently took more than they gave would find themselves gradually excluded from these crucial networks, while generosity within one's means built social capital that could be drawn upon in times of need. Collective security was another aspect of community life. In the absence of professional police or firefighting services, villagers relied on each other for protection against threats. A village watch might take turns keeping an eye out for dangers. Fire, a constant threat in homes with open hearths and thatch roofs, would be fought by bucket brigades of villagers working together. After disasters like storms or fires, the community would mobilize to help affected families rebuild. The raising of children was less exclusively familial than in our modern nuclear families. While parents were the primary caregivers, the close proximity of village life meant that children were observed and guided by many adults. They might be fed at a neighbor's home if playing there at mealtime, corrected by any adult who saw misbehavior, or comforted by whoever was nearest when they fell. This created multiple attachments and influences beyond the immediate family, as well as a strong sense of belonging to the larger community. Education, though not formalized for most children, happened through this community immersion. Children learned not just from their parents, but from various skilled adults in the village. A child might informally apprentice with the village blacksmith, learn midwifery from an experienced woman, or absorb carpentry skills by helping with community building projects. Knowledge was transmitted through observation, participation, and oral instruction rather than formal schooling for most peasant children. Life transitions were marked and managed communally. Births were attended by the village midwife and other experienced women. Marriages were community events, with the entire village participating in the celebration and various customs designed to help the new couple establish their household. Deaths brought the community together for funeral rituals, practical support for the bereaved family, and redistribution of the deceased's roles and responsibilities. Governance in the village operated through a mixture of formal and informal mechanisms. Many villages had a council of householders that made decisions about agricultural timing, maintenance of common resources, and minor disputes. Village custom, the way things have always been done, carried significant weight, with innovations adopted cautiously and by consensus. The Lord Steward or bailiff might have nominal authority, but day-to-day management of village affairs was often handled internally. This community-based life created a profound sense of belonging and identity. Medieval peasants didn't think of themselves primarily as individuals, but as members of a specific village, parish, and family line. This embedded identity provided security and meaning, but could also be constraining. Deviation from community norms might be met with suspicion or ostracism. The flip side of strong community bonds was the limited privacy and intense social surveillance of village life. Everyone knew everyone else's business, from economic fortunes to family disputes. Reputation was a precious resource, carefully maintained through adherence to community expectations. Gossip served as a powerful mechanism of social control, with the threat of becoming the subject of negative talk, motivating conformity to shared values. For all its solidarity, medieval village life was not without conflicts. Disputes over boundaries, inheritance, resource use, and personal slights inevitably arose. These were typically resolved through informal mediation by respected community members, public apologies and reconciliation rituals, or in more serious cases, through the manor court system overseen by the local lord or his representatives. The community provided a crucial safety net in times of individual hardship. If a family's breadwinner was injured or died, if fire destroyed a home, or if crops failed on a particular plot, neighbors would step in with food, labor, building materials, or temporary shelter. This mutual aid was not charity in the modern sense, but a recognized system of reciprocity. Today's helpers might need help themselves tomorrow. This communal approach to life created resilience in the face of hardship. While individual families might struggle or even perish in isolation, the pooled resources, knowledge, and labor of the village community could weather many challenges that would overwhelm a single household. The village, not the individual family, was the true survival unit of medieval rural life. What emerges from this picture is a way of life that was neither the romanticized pastoral idyll sometimes portrayed, nor the unrelieved misery depicted in other accounts. Medieval village life was hard by modern standards, constrained by technology and resources, and subject to dangers we've largely forgotten, but it was also rich in human connection, embedded in natural cycles, and sustained by a web of mutual support that gave meaning and security to everyday existence. This communal dimension of medieval life offers a counterpoint to our increasingly individualistic modern society. While few would wish to return to the material conditions of medieval peasantry, there may be wisdom in their understanding that human survival and flourishing are fundamentally collective enterprises requiring cooperation, reciprocity, and shared purpose. Gentle closing, and thus was life inside a medieval peasant's house, simple, hard, but also full of small moments of calm. By the light of the fire, lulled by the sound of the wind and crickets, they slept dreaming of harvests, of the return of seasons, and of another day of survival. Now, let this tranquil story lull your mind, take a deep breath, and allow yourself to rest. Good night. As our journey through medieval daily life comes to a close, let us linger a moment longer in this world, so different from our own, yet connected to us through the unchanging rhythms of human experience. As night falls on our medieval village, the last activities of the day wind down in the soft glow of firelight. The day's work is done, the animals are settled in their places, the children, tired from play and chores, have taken their places on their pallets. The fire has been banked for the night, its embers casting a gentle orange glow that dances across the darkened walls. Outside, the wind might rustle the thatch or bring the distant howl of a wolf from the forest edge. Perhaps rain patters gently on the roof, its sound muffled by the thick layers of straw. Inside, the family settles into the quiet rhythms of evening. Voices lower naturally as darkness gathers. A father might carve a small wooden toy by the fire's light, the soft scraping of his knife against wood a meditative sound. A mother might continue spinning, her fingers working by touch more than sight as the spindle twirls and the thread grows. An elder might share stories, tales of saints and heroes, local legends or family histories that connect the listeners to those who came before them. These evening hours, between work and sleep, held a special quality. Modern researchers call this time the watch, a period of relaxed wakefulness before the deeper sleep of midnight. For medieval people, this might be a time of quiet conversation, of planning for tomorrow's work, of prayer, or simply of restful silence. As they prepared for sleep, they might speak the names of protective saints, touch a charm hung by the door for good fortune, or make the sign of the cross over the sleeping children. These small rituals provided a sense of security, a gentle boundary between the vulnerabilities of sleep and the uncertainties of the world. Their dreams, like ours, would carry the residue of the day's experiences, the feel of soil between fingers, the weight of a scythe swinging through wheat, the taste of bread broken and shared. But they might also dream of the miraculous and magical world depicted in church paintings, of angels and demons, of spirits said to inhabit the ancient oak in the village centre, or of the mysterious creatures believed to roam the forest after dark. And while they slept, the house itself seemed to keep watch over them. The ancient beams that had sheltered generations creaked softly with the night's temperature changes. The walls, built of earth and straw and human labor, held back the wilderness. The stored food, the carefully maintained tools, the woven fabrics, all represented security, continuity, the thin margin between survival and disaster that was the constant reality of medieval life. Morning would come with the first light, or perhaps with the rooster's crow. The woman of the house would usually rise first, stirring the fire's embers to life, beginning the day's first tasks while others still slept. The cycle would begin again, water to be fetched, animals to be fed, bread to be baked, fields to be tended. The great wheel of the year would turn one more day forward, bringing the community closer to the next seasonal milestone, planting, harvesting, midwinter, midsummer, markers in the continuous flow of a life lived close to nature's rhythms. This medieval world was not idyllic. It held hunger, disease, infant mortality, and the constant specter of war or natural disaster that could destroy in a day what had taken generations to build. It was a life of physical hardship and limited horizons by our modern standards, and yet within this seemingly constrained existence lived people who loved, laughed, created beauty with their hands, found meaning in their connection to land and community, and experienced the full range of human emotion and experience. Their lives, so different from our own, can still speak to us across the centuries. They remind us of human adaptability and resilience. They show us that community and connection can flourish even in material simplicity. They demonstrate how closely human life was once woven into the fabric of natural cycles and seasonal change. Perhaps as you drift towards sleep, you might carry with you an appreciation for the comforts of your modern life. The clean water that flows at the turn of a tap, the steady warmth that requires no constant tending, the soft bed that cradles you without the need to gather straw or feathers. Yet perhaps you might also recognize what we have lost, the deep connection to natural rhythms, the integrated family and community life, the direct relationship between human effort and survival. This journey through medieval daily life offers us not just historical knowledge, but a mirror in which to see our own lives more clearly, our privileges, our losses, our place in the long human story. As you close your eyes, imagine for a moment that you can hear the soft breathing of family members around you, feel the earth solid beneath your home, and sense the vast star-filled sky above the thatched roof. Connected to the past, present. In the now you can drift peacefully into dreams, just as countless humans have done through every age of our shared history. Sleep well, traveler through time. The medieval village fades into the darkness of history, but its echo remains in the structures of our modern world, in the calendar we follow, in the foods we eat, and in the communities we build. Good night. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest deep, and your awakening gentle to the possibilities of a new day. Afterword, the legacy of medieval life. While we've reached the end of our bedtime journey, it's worth reflecting briefly on how the medieval world continues to influence our modern lives, even as we move through environments that would be unrecognizable to our ancestors. Many of our modern towns and cities still follow medieval street patterns, with central market, squares and radiating roads that once led to fields and neighboring settlements. Our holidays and festivals often have direct connections to medieval religious and agricultural celebrations. Christmas, Easter, Halloween, May Day, and harvest festivals all have medieval roots, though their expressions have changed over time. The foods we eat still bear the imprint of medieval kitchens. Bread, cheese, beer, wine, and many preserved foods like pickles or cured meats were staples then as now, though our versions are more refined and our access to them far more consistent. Even the herbs we grow in modern gardens often reflect medieval selections, chosen for both culinary and medicinal properties. Our language, literature, and art draw heavily from medieval sources. Fairy tales first told around medieval fires, heroic stories that inspired generations of knights and commoners alike, artistic techniques developed in medieval workshops, all these continue to shape our cultural expressions. Perhaps most significantly, many of our fundamental social institutions and concepts trace their development through the medieval period. Our legal systems, universities, hospitals, banking structures, and even our notions of romantic love bear the imprint of medieval innovations and evolutions. Understanding medieval daily life helps us see these connections more clearly, not as dusty historical artifacts, but as living traditions that continue to shape our experience. The medieval period, far from being a dark age between classical antiquity and Renaissance rebirth, was a time of adaptation, innovation, and the development of distinctly European cultural forms that continue to influence global society. As modern people facing modern challenges, climate change, technological disruption, social fragmentation, we might find wisdom in how medieval communities approach their own existential challenges, through cooperation, through adaptation, to local conditions, through the development of resilient local systems, and through finding meaning in the cycles of work and rest, scarcity and celebration. This isn't to romanticize the very real hardships and limitations of medieval life, but to recognize that each era of human history holds lessons for those who come after. Our medieval ancestors, living close to the land in tight-knit communities, understood certain truths about sustainability, interdependence, and resilience that our more individualistic and technologically mediated society sometimes struggles to remember. So as you finally drift into sleep, consider that you are part of this long human story, neither its beginning nor its end, but a link in a chain that stretches back through medieval villages and beyond, and forward into futures we can only imagine. In that continuity, in that belonging to the great human family across time, there is a profound comfort. Sleep well, knowing you are never truly alone. Good night. The medieval peasant's year, a cycle of seasons, spring, renewal, and laborers. Winter's grip loosened and the first hints of green appeared in the hedgerows. The medieval village stirred with renewed energy. Spring was a season of hope, but also of intense labor after the relative quiet of winter. The agricultural year began in earnest as soon as the ground could be worked. Fields that had lain fallow during winter would be plowed, a task requiring immense physical effort. The heavy wooden plow, sometimes with an iron-tipped share, would be pulled by oxen while the plowman struggled to keep the furrows straight. Children might follow behind, breaking up clods with wooden mallets or picking up stones that the plow had unearthed. Sowing followed plowing, a skilled task typically performed by men walking rhythmically across the prepared fields, broadcasting. Seeds with practiced sweeps of the arm. Precise amounts of precious seed grain had been saved from the previous harvest, specifically for this purpose. Prayers and sometimes rituals accompanied this crucial activity, as the community's survival depended on a successful germination. These garden plots nearer to houses would be turned with spades and prepared for vegetables and herbs. Women and older children typically managed these essential spaces, which provided much of the family's daily food. Carefully saved seeds, peas, beans, onions, garlic, cabbages, would be sown according to phases of the moon and traditional timing passed down through generations. Spring was also lambing season, a time when shepherds might sleep in the fields to attend to pregnant ewes, helping with difficult births and protecting vulnerable newborns from predators. The survival of these lambs was crucial, not just for meat but for the wool that would clothe the community. As fruit trees blossomed, villagers watched anxiously. A late frost could destroy the promise of autumn's harvest. Beekeepers prepared new hives or cleaned existing ones, ready for the season of flowering and honey production. The village's woodlands required spring management as well. Coppicing, cutting certain trees to ground level to stimulate new growth, would be done in carefully managed rotations, providing straight, thin poles for construction, tool handles, and fencing, while ensuring the woodland's long-term productivity. With stores from the previous harvest running low, spring could bring the hungry gap. Weeks when food was scarce before the first new crops were ready. Wild foods helped bridge this gap. Young nettles for soup, early mushrooms and various foraged greens supplemented dwindling supplies of grain and preserved foods. Religious observances structured the spring calendar. Lent, the 40 days, before Easter, was a time of fasting and abstinence from certain foods, particularly meat and dairy products. This religious practice coincided practically with the natural scarcity of the season. Easter itself brought celebration, special foods and a welcome break from Lenten restrictions. Household spring cleaning was not just a matter of aesthetics, but of health. The winter's accumulation of smoke residue, food scraps and general grime would be addressed with a thoroughness that matched the seriousness of the task. Fresh rushes or sweet-smelling herbs might be strewn on floors, wall hangings aired and beaten, and bedding washed and dried in the strengthening sun. As days lengthened, work hours extended as well. With so much to be done and the weather finally allowing outdoor work, dawn-to-dusk labor became the norm. Yet spring also brought a particular quality of light, a freshness to the air, and visual beauties, wildflowers, new leaves, returning. Birds that lifted spirits after winter's confinement. Summer, growth and vigilance as spring turned to summer. The medieval village found itself in a period of watchful waiting. The crops were planted, the young animals born, and now came the vigilant tending that would determine whether the community would feast or famish in the coming year. Field work during summer focused on weeding, back-breaking labor performed by men, women and children, carefully removing unwanted plants that competed with the precious grain crops. This task required discernment and knowledge, distinguishing similar-looking plants and understanding which wild plants could be harvested for food or medicine rather than simply discarded. Water management became critical in summer. Depending on the region, either irrigation or drainage might be necessary to ensure crop survival. Communal work parties might clear drainage ditches or construct simple irrigation channels, directing precious water where it was most needed. Gardens required constant attention, watering, weeding, and the beginning of harvests of early crops like peas, beans, and certain herbs. These fresh foods were welcome additions to the diet after months of preserved foods, and they required immediate consumption or preservation as they ripened. The crucial hay harvest typically occurred in early summer. Meadows would be mown using scythes, an activity requiring skill, strength, and rhythm. The cut hay would be turned repeatedly with wooden rakes to dry evenly, then gathered and stored in stacks or under shelter. This hay was not merely helpful but essential. It would feed livestock through the following winter, and insufficient hay could mean having to slaughter animals that couldn't be fed, reducing the breeding stock for future years. Sheep shearing took place once the weather was reliably warm. The village might work together on this task, with experienced shearers removing the wool in, ideally, one piece per sheep using simple iron clippers. The fleeces would then begin their transformation into cloth, washed, carded, spun, and eventually woven in a process that would continue throughout the year. Summer brought particular threats that required communal vigilance. Sudden storms could flatten ripening grain. Drought could wither crops. Pests like locusts could destroy vegetation. Lightning could set fire to the dry thatch of houses. Each danger had its traditional responses, from religious processions to practical firefighting preparations. Despite the hard work, summer offered pleasures as well. Swimming in rivers or ponds provided relief from heat and opportunities for play. Longer evening light allowed for socializing after work was done. Seasonal fruits, early berries, cherries, provided sweet treats especially appreciated by children. Midsummer, coinciding with the feast of St. John the Baptist, June 24th, was marked by celebrations in many regions. Bonfires would be lit, sometimes on hilltops, creating chains of light across the countryside. Young people might leap over smaller fires, an act believed to ensure good fortune. Herbs gathered on Midsummer's Eve were thought to have enhanced healing properties, so this was an important time for replenishing medicinal supplies. As summer progressed, the community's attention increasingly focused on the approaching grain harvest, the most critical event of the agricultural year. Tools would be prepared, repaired, and sharpened. Arrangements would be made for extra hands if needed. The weather would be watched with increasing anxiety as the grain ripened and became vulnerable to damage from rain or storms. By late summer, the well-being of the community for the coming year hung visibly in the balance, written in the golden fields of ripening grain that surrounded the village, the outcome of countless hours of labor still dependent on weather and fortune in these final crucial weeks. Autumn, harvest and preparation. Harvest dominated the autumn season, an all-consuming period of intense labor when every able-bodied person in the community worked from dawn until dusk to bring in the crops that would determine their survival through the coming year. The grain harvest was the centerpiece of this activity. Ripe wheat, rye, barley or oats would be cut using sickles or scythes, bound into sheaves, and stood in stooks, upright bundles, in the fields to dry. This critical work proceeded with a sense of urgency. Rain could damage the ripe grain, and every day of good weather was precious. Once sufficiently dried, the sheaves would be brought to the threshing floor, a specially prepared hard surface, often in a barn. There the grain would be separated from the straw by threshing, beating with flails, or by having animals walk over it. The grain would then be winnowed, tossed into the air so that breeze could blow away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier grain behind. Finally, the clean grain would be measured and stored, with portions set aside for next year's seed, for payment of rents or tithes, and for the community's consumption. While the grain harvest received the most attention, other crops were gathered as well. Peas and beans would be harvested once their pods had dried on the plants. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots might be left in the ground until needed or stored in cool, dry conditions. Apples, pears, and nuts would be gathered as they ripened, for immediate use and for storage. The end of harvest was typically marked by celebration, harvest home, Lammas, or similar festivals that combine Thanksgiving for the completed harvest, with community feasting. These celebrations provided a crucial psychological release after weeks of intensive labor and worry. They often featured special foods, music, dancing, and sometimes the crowning of a harvest queen or king. With basic survival assured by the gathered harvest, attention turned to preserving food for winter and spring. Fruits might be dried or made into preserves with honey. Vegetables could be pickled in vinegar or brine. Herbs would be dried in bunches hung from rafters. Autumn was also when many animals were slaughtered, a necessity since not all could be fed through winter with limited fodder. This created a brief period of plenty, as fresh meat became available, but also an intensive period of food preservation. Meat would be salted, smoked, or dried to create stores that would last through winter and beyond. Blood from slaughtered animals would be used to make blood sausages and puddings. Intestines would become sausage casings. Fats would be rendered for cooking and lighting. Even bones would be utilized for tools, buttons, and soup stock. Firewood collection intensified as well. Deadfall would be gathered from woodlands, branches pruned from trees, tree stumps dug up for their roots. All would be split, stacked, and sheltered to dry for winter use. The brewing of ale or beer often increased in autumn, taking advantage of the newly harvested grain. This was both practical, creating a safe beverage for winter consumption, and festive, providing drink for the season's celebrations. As daylight shortened, indoor work began to take precedence again. Evening gatherings might combine labor, spinning, repair of tools and equipment, with social activities like storytelling or singing. The community drew together as outdoor work decreased and people spent more time in the close quarters of their homes. Late autumn brought preparation of fields for the following year. Winter grains like winter wheat or rye would be sown before the hard frosts. Fields that would lie fallow or be planted in spring might be ploughed to expose pest larvae to frost and birds. Houses required autumn maintenance as well, thatched. Roofs would be repaired, gaps in walls filled, and general preparations made for the coming winter. Livestock shelters would be cleaned and prepared, with bedding material stockpiled. As the leaves fell and the landscape gradually shifted to winter's starkness, the medieval village found itself in a period of relative plenty. The stores were full, the preservation work complete, and the immediate pressure of survival temporarily eased. This brief respite would be savored through the early winter celebrations before the deepest part of winter brought its own challenges. Winter endurance. And community winter in the medieval village was a time of reduced outdoor activity, but not of idleness. As fields lay dormant under frost or snow, work shifted to indoor tasks, maintenance, and the strengthening of community bonds that would sustain the village through the cold months. The shortened daylight hours naturally limited work time, creating a different rhythm than the long, labor-intensive days of summer. People rose with the light and completed essential outdoor chores, tending livestock, collecting water, gathering firewood, before turning to indoor activities that could be done by firelight. Textile work occupied much of winter's indoor time. The processed wool from summer's shearing would be spun into thread, then woven into cloth for clothing, blankets, and other necessities. This work often had a social dimension, with neighbors gathering in the home with the best light or warmest fire, sharing the labor while also sharing stories, songs, and news. Woodcrafts flourished in winter. Men would carve or construct tools, utensils, furniture, and agricultural implements needed for the coming year. Repairs to existing items would be made. These skills were passed down as younger members of the household watched and gradually participated in increasingly complex aspects of the work. Food preparation remained a constant activity. Grain would be ground into flour for bread. Preserved meats and vegetables would be prepared into stews and pottages. The precious stores were carefully managed to ensure they would last until spring brought fresh foods. The winter brought its own feast days and celebrations, providing bright spots in the cold and darkness. Christmas was marked with special foods, small gifts, evergreen decorations, and community observances. The 12 days of Christmas, extending to Epiphany on January 6th, created a period of celebration during the darkest time of year. Candlemas, February 2nd, marked the deepening of winter but also the gradual lengthening of days, often celebrated with candle processions symbolizing the return of light. These winter celebrations served important psychological purposes, breaking up the monotony of winter and providing opportunities for community bonding. They also helped mark the passage of time during a season when the landscape offered fewer natural indicators of seasonal progression. Winter evenings brought the community together in ways that the busy work seasons did not allow. After the day's essential tasks were complete, households might gather together for shared activities. These gatherings served multiple purposes: conservation of fuel and light, shared warmth, social connection, and the transmission of cultural knowledge. During these gatherings, the oral traditions of the community would be maintained and passed to younger generations. Older members might tell stories, some purely for entertainment, others containing practical knowledge encoded in narrative form, and still others reinforcing religious or moral values. Folk songs, many tied to the cycles of agricultural work or to historical events, would be taught and sung together. Local customs, superstitions, and traditional practices would be discussed and explained. Winter was also a time for games and contests that sharpened skills while providing entertainment. Chess and simpler board games passed the time while developing strategic thinking. Storytelling competitions cultivated memory and verbal creativity. Physical games played outdoors on milder days maintained strength and coordination during a season of otherwise reduced activity. Despite the community support, winter presented significant challenges. Illness spread more easily when people were confined in close quarters with limited ventilation. Food supplies might run low before spring, especially if the previous harvest had been poor. Severe weather could isolate the village, preventing travel to markets or neighboring communities. The elderly and very young were particularly vulnerable during winter. The community developed various mechanisms for supporting these members, sharing fuel with elderly neighbors, providing extra food to families with many young children, taking turns checking on those living alone. These practices weren't seen as charity, but as mutual aid, part of the social contract that held the community together across seasons and generations. By late winter, as stored foods dwindled and the temperature began to moderate, the community would look eagerly for signs of spring. The first snowdrops pushing through melting snow, buds swelling on trees, or the return of migratory birds. These signs brought hope and renewed energy as the great cycle prepared to begin again with spring's renewal and labor. Through this yearly cycle of seasons, the medieval peasant community maintained its existence, adapting to changing conditions, supporting its members, and preserving the knowledge and traditions that enabled survival in a challenging world. Their intimate connection to these natural cycles created a different relationship to time than our modern clock-driven experience, one more attuned to light and darkness, warmth and cold, growth and dormancy, the fundamental rhythms that still underlie our more technologically buffered lives. The medieval peasant family, roles and relationships, childhood and learning childhood in medieval peasant society differed dramatically from our modern conception. Rather than being seen as a distinct and protected phase of life, children were integrated into the working household from their earliest years, gradually taking on responsibilities as their capabilities developed. Infants were typically swaddled, wrapped tightly in linen bands that restricted movement, but were believed to help limbs grow straight and provide security. These swaddled babies might be hung on pegs on the wall while their mothers worked, or placed in simple wooden cradles that could be rocked with a foot while hands remained busy with other tasks. Breastfeeding was the norm, sometimes continuing for 2 years or more. This provided not just nutrition but natural spacing of pregnancies through the contraceptive effect of frequent nursing. Weaning foods included soft bread soaked in milk or broth, gradually introducing the child to the adult diet. As soon as they could toddle, young children would begin their integration into the working household. By age 4 or 5, they would have small duties, fetching items, shooing away chickens from gardens, watching younger siblings. These responsibilities increased gradually, with children of 7 or 8 contributing significantly to household. Work education was primarily vocational and occurred within the household. Girls learned domestic skills by working alongside mothers, grandmothers, and aunts, cooking, cleaning, textile production, gardening, and animal care. Boys similarly learned agricultural techniques, woodcraft, and animal husbandry from fathers and other male relatives. Both genders typically learned basic foraging, food preservation, and seasonal patterns of work. Formal academic education was rare for peasant children. A village priest might teach basic literacy to a few promising boys, particularly those who showed potential for clerical roles. But for most, knowledge was transmitted orally and through demonstration rather than through reading and writing. The community supplemented family education. A child might learn specialized skills like blacksmithing or midwifery through informal apprenticeship with a village specialist. Religious knowledge came through church attendance and community celebrations of holy days, where biblical stories were conveyed through sermons, plays, and visual representations. Play was interwoven with learning. Children's games often mimicked adult activities, playing at farming, housekeeping, or crafts using miniature versions of adult tools. These games developed both physical skills and social understanding needed for adult roles. Other games developed specific abilities: throwing games for hunting skills, chasing games for speed and stamina, hiding games for observation and patience. Discipline typically emphasized practical consequences, and community standards rather than abstract morality. A child who failed to watch the family cow might go without milk. One who broke a tool through carelessness might have to help repair it. Physical punishment existed, but was generally seen as less effective than natural consequences and social pressure. The transition to adulthood was gradual rather than marked by a specific age. By their early teens, children would be performing essentially adult work, though perhaps with less expectation of output. Marriage, which might occur in the mid-teens for girls and somewhat later for boys, generally marked full adult status, though unmarried adult children continued to contribute to their parents' household. This integration of children into working life had both advantages and disadvantages by modern standards. Children developed practical skills, responsibility, and community connection from an early age. However, childhood mortality was high, work could be physically demanding, and opportunities for exploration beyond the immediate community were limited. Yet within these constraints, medieval records and folk traditions suggest children found joy, play, and meaningful connection within the structured rhythms of peasant life. Marriage and partnership. Marriage in medieval peasant society was first and foremost an economic partnership, the creation of a new productive household unit within the village economy. While affection might develop, the primary considerations in marriage arrangements were practical. The complementary skills of the partners, their capacity for work, their potential contributions to a shared household, and their family connections within the community. The process of courtship and marriage varied by region, but followed broadly similar patterns across much of Europe. Young people might meet during communal work events, religious festivals, or at markets. Supervised opportunities for interaction allowed potential partners to assess each other's character, work ethic, and compatibility. Parents and other family members played significant roles in marriage decisions, particularly in arrangements involving land transfers or other economic considerations. However, historical records suggest that most peasant marriages involved at least some choice by the partners themselves, unlike the more rigidly arranged marriages of the nobility. For a marriage to proceed, the couple needed not just family approval but sufficient resources to establish a viable household. This might include land access through inheritance, rental, or communal rights, basic tools and equipment, household goods, and in some cases, livestock. Families typically contributed these necessities as marriage portions or dowries. The formal marriage process generally involved several stages. A betrothal or engagement established the intent to marry and often had legal standing. Bans would be announced at church for several weeks, allowing any impediments to the marriage, such as previously unknown family relationships, to be raised. The wedding itself combined religious ceremonies with community celebration. The wedding feast was an important community event, with contributions of food and drink from many households, creating a celebration that reinforced social bonds beyond the immediate families. Special foods, music, dancing, and various local customs marked this major life transition. Once married, couples typically established their own household, though in some regions or circumstances, a newly married couple might live with the parents of one partner temporarily while establishing their independent resources. The rarity of divorce and the likelihood of early death for one partner meant that many individuals married multiple times during their lives. Within marriage, work was generally divided along gender lines, though with considerable overlap and flexibility. Based on circumstance, men typically handled heavy fieldwork, larger livestock, woodcutting, and building maintenance. Women managed the household, garden plots, dairy processing, textile production, and poultry. However, during harvest or other critical periods, everyone worked where needed, regardless of usual divisions. This partnership extended to household management. While men might have legal primacy in many regions, practical evidence suggests that decisions were often made jointly, with each partner deferring to the other's expertise in their respective areas of work. The interdependence of their labors necessitated cooperation and mutual respect for the household to function effectively. Childbearing was a central aspect of marriage, providing both the workforce for the family enterprise and security for old age. Pregnancies typically began soon after marriage and might continue throughout a woman's fertile years. The spacing of pregnancies was influenced by breastfeeding patterns and occasionally by limited knowledge of herbal contraceptive methods. Pregnancy and childbirth brought particular dangers for women. Delivery was typically attended by female relatives and perhaps a village midwife with practical experience rather than formal training. Complications during childbirth were a significant cause of female mortality, and the loss of a mother often proved disastrous for the surviving family. Emotional bonds within marriage, while not emphasized in the formal or economic structures, nevertheless developed through shared work, mutual dependence, and the raising of children. Folk songs, stories, and court records provide glimpses of affection, jealousy, loyalty, and grief that suggest emotional attachments formed the lived experience of marriage, even when not its official purpose. Sexuality within marriage was considered natural and necessary, both for procreation and for maintaining the bond between partners. Church teachings might emphasize procreation as the primary purpose of marital relations, but folk customs and medical texts from the period suggest a more nuanced understanding of sexual pleasure and relationship maintenance. The death of a spouse created both emotional trauma and practical crisis. The surviving partner faced the challenge of maintaining a household designed for two working adults. Quick remarriage was common and practical, particularly when young children were involved. Community support would bridge the gap between death and remarriage, with neighbors helping the widow or widower until a new household arrangement could be established. Despite its primarily economic foundation, medieval peasant marriage created the fundamental social unit of the village, a partnership that combined productive labor, reproductive potential, and the transmission of skills and values to the next generation. Within its practical framework, these partnerships accommodated the full range of human emotional experience: love and conflict, joy and sorrow, intimacy and independence, creating households that were both economic entities and homes in the fullest sense. Elders and their role aging in medieval peasant society brought both challenges and shifts in status. Unlike our modern concept of retirement, older people remained integrated in the working household as long as physically able, with roles adapting to their changing capabilities. The concept of elderly itself differed from our modern understanding. Physical condition rather than chronological age determined one's category. Those who remained vigorous might continue regular work into what we would consider old age, while those with physical limitations might transition to different roles earlier. Generally, someone who had survived to 50 or 60 years would be considered elderly by medieval standards. As physical strength declined, elders shifted to less demanding but still essential tasks. An older man might focus on tool repair, supervising younger workers, or managing livestock rather than ploughing. An older woman might concentrate on spinning, which could be done seated, minding young children or food processing rather than heavier household tasks. These adapted roles allowed elders to continue contributing to household productivity while accommodating physical limitations. This continued participation was essential both economically, every household member needed to contribute, and psychologically, maintaining the elder's sense of purpose and place within the family. Beyond practical work, elders served as repositories of knowledge and wisdom. Having lived through multiple cycles of seasons, they carried critical information about weather patterns, crop variations, animal behavior, and effective techniques that younger generations had not yet experienced. An elder might remember the last severe drought or frost and recall how the community had survived it, knowledge that could prove life-saving. Specialized knowledge often resided with elders. An elderly woman might be the community's most experienced midwife or herbalist, having accumulated decades of practical healing knowledge. An elderly man might be the most skilled woodworker, or the one who remembered the boundaries of common lands from before the most recent Lord's adjustments. Elders also preserved cultural memory and identity. They maintained the oral histories of the community, stories of notable events, lineages of families, accounts of how certain customs began. Through storytelling, particularly to children, they transmitted both practical knowledge and the values and identity of the community. In many regions, elders played formal or informal roles in village governance. Their perspective and experience made them valuable counselors in disputes or decisions affecting the community. An informal council of respected elders might resolve conflicts, allocate communal resources, or negotiate with authorities on behalf of the village. The care of elderly family members typically fell to their adult children or other relatives. Multiple generation households were common, with grandparents, parents, and children living together in a single dwelling or in very close proximity. This arrangement allowed for shared care responsibilities and enabled elders to continue contributing to the household as their abilities allowed. The nature of this care was primarily practical rather than medical. There was little effective treatment for many age-related conditions, but accommodations could be made. A warmer sleeping place near the fire, easier access to necessities, or food prepared to accommodate dental issues. These care arrangements were not simply charitable, but represented an implicit social contract. Parents had raised children who would eventually care for them in old age. This reciprocity was expected and respected, though historical records indicate it was not always fulfilled perfectly. The church provided additional support through alms for those without family care. Some communities maintained widows' cottages or similar arrangements for elderly people without family support. Monasteries sometimes provided housing and care for elderly individuals who could offer a donation, however modest, or who had skills valuable to the monastic community. Death was seen as a natural part of the life cycle rather than a medical failure. When an elder fell into final illness, care focused on comfort, spiritual preparation, and ensuring the opportunity to settle worldly affairs. The presence of family, receipt of last rites from a priest, and the opportunity to distribute personal possessions were considered elements of a good death. Funeral practices emphasized both religious salvation and community continuity. The body would be prepared by family members, waked in the home, and buried in the church cemetery with ceremonies that combined Christian rites with local customs. The communal funeral meal that followed served both to honor the deceased and to reinforce the bonds among the living who would continue the work of survival. The inheritance of resources, rights, and responsibilities was carefully managed, whether through formal wills, more common among wealthier peasants, or through community-witnessed verbal declarations. Land usage rights, tools, livestock, and household goods would be distributed, often with specific items, carrying both practical value and emotional significance. Even after death, elders remained present in the life of the community through the stories told about them, the techniques they had taught, and the values they had exemplified. Their graves in the churchyard kept them physically close to the community they had helped build and sustain. In many belief systems, they were thought to continue watching over the living, particularly at certain times of year when the boundary between living and dead was considered thinner. This integration of aging and death into the natural cycle of community life created a different relationship to mortality than our modern perspective. While death was more visible and often came earlier, it was also more integrated into the texture of daily experience, less isolated, less medicalized, and in some ways less feared. The elder approaching death could see their continuity in the children they had raised, the knowledge they had transmitted, and the community they had helped sustain, a kind of immortality more immediate and tangible than abstract concepts of afterlife. The spiritual world of the medieval peasant faith and daily practice. The spiritual life of medieval peasants was not confined to Sunday church attendance, but permeated every aspect of daily existence. Their world was understood through a complex blend of official Catholic doctrine, local religious customs, and elements of older belief systems that had been incorporated into folk Christianity. The physical center of religious life was the parish church, often the only stone building in the village and a source of both literal and symbolic shelter. Here the community gathered for Mass, baptisms, weddings, funerals, and seasonal celebrations. The church building itself was considered sacred space, with its altar housing relics of saints, its walls decorated with religious imagery that taught biblical stories to the largely illiterate congregation, and its cemetery providing a physical connection to ancestors. The parish priest served as intermediary between the community and the divine. His role encompassed not just religious ceremonies, but often basic medical care, conflict resolution, record-keeping and communication with authorities beyond the village. While priests were supposed to be educated and morally exemplary, historical records show wide variation in their actual education, commitment and behavior. The liturgical calendar structured the year, interweaving sacred time with agricultural rhythms. Major feast days like Christmas, Easter and Saints' Days, appropriate to the local church, provided breaks from work and opportunities for celebration. Fast days and periods like Lent and Advent imposed dietary restrictions and penitential practices. These observances created a rhythm of alternating austerity and celebration that broke up the year and provided psychological balance. Daily religious practice extended beyond formal church services. Morning prayers might be said before beginning work. The Angelus bell, rung from the church at dawn, noon and dusk, prompted brief prayers and marked the day's progression. Simple blessings might be spoken over meals, at the beginning of significant tasks like ploughing or harvesting, or in response to sudden changes in weather. The sacraments marked life transitions and connected individual experience to universal. Christian narratives. Baptism, ideally performed soon after birth, incorporated the child into the church community. Confession and penance provided mechanisms for addressing moral failings and conflicts. The Eucharist, received at least annually, after confession, established direct contact with the divine. Marriage blessed and legitimized family formation. Last rites prepared the dying for the journey beyond. Saints served as specialized divine intermediaries, each associated with particular concerns or areas of life. Local patron saints received special veneration, with their feast days often becoming major community celebrations. Saints were understood to have particular domains. St. Barbara protected against lightning, St. Blaise against throat ailments, St. Anthony helped find lost items, and so on. This created a practical menu of spiritual resources for different situations. Relics, physical remains or possessions of saints, were believed to channel divine power. The local church would house at least a few relics, often in the altar. More significant collections might be found in regional churches or monasteries, becoming destinations for pilgrimage. A journey to such sites, whether undertaken for general, spiritual merit or to seek healing or other divine intervention, represented a significant life event for most peasants, whose travel was otherwise limited. The veneration of Mary, Mother of Jesus, held special significance in peasant spirituality. As both virgin and mother, divine yet human, Mary represented an accessible feminine aspect of the divine. Her cult was particularly important to women who might pray to her during childbirth or other female-specific concerns. Many local churches were dedicated to Mary, and her feast days were major celebrations. Beyond official church teachings, a rich layer of folk Christianity incorporated elements of older belief systems and practical spirituality. Sacred wells, trees, or stones that had been venerated in pre-Christian times were reframed as sites of saints' miracles or appearances of Mary. Seasonal celebrations contained elements of nature reverence alongside their Christian meanings. These practices were not necessarily seen as contradicting official religion, but as complementary expressions of spiritual reality. Charms, blessings, and protective rituals formed part of daily spiritual practice. Their cross might be traced in the air before beginning a journey. Special words or gestures accompanied the first planting or harvesting. Certain herbs gathered at specific times, particularly midsummer, were believed to have enhanced protective or healing properties. Houses might be blessed with special herbs or water from the church font to protect against harm. The unseen world was understood to be populated by various spiritual entities beyond God, the saints and angels. While official doctrine classified many of these beliefs as superstition, in practice they formed part of the peasant's spiritual landscape. Household spirits might protect the home if properly acknowledged. Nature spirits inhabited woods, water sources, and wild places. The dead might return at certain times, particularly around All Saints' Day, requiring rituals of welcome and appeasement. Concepts of sin, virtue, and divine judgment provided a moral framework that helped regulate social behavior. The 7 deadly sins and corresponding virtues were taught through sermons, wall paintings, and morality plays. The consequences of sin were vividly depicted in images of hell and damnation, while the rewards of virtue appeared in representations of heaven. These powerful visualizations helped reinforce moral teachings in a largely illiterate society. Understanding of theological doctrines varied widely. While basic prayers and creeds might be memorized, sophisticated theological concepts were often understood through concrete imagery and narrative rather than abstract thought. Christ's sacrifice might be understood primarily through the physical suffering depicted in church art rather than through complex doctrines of atonement. Expressions of religiosity took various physical forms. Pilgrim badges collected from visited shrines might be worn as both spiritual protection and status symbols. Simple crosses of wood or, for the more affluent, metal might be worn or displayed. In homes, special candles blessed at Candlemas would be kept for use during storms or at deathbeds. Holy water from the church font might be taken home in small containers for protective blessings. Magic and religion overlapped in medieval Peasant. Understanding what modern people might classify as magic, healing charms, weather prediction, protection against evil, was often framed in religious terms, invoking saints or using Christian symbols. The line between prayer and spell, blessing and incantation, religious ritual and magical working was blurry at best. This spiritual framework provided explanation and meaning for otherwise frightening or random events. Crop failures, storms, illness, or unexpected good fortune could all be interpreted within a system that saw divine and supernatural forces at work in everyday life. This created a sense of cosmic order and meaning, even when events were devastating. Beyond explanation, faith provided hope and resilience in the face of hardship. The belief in God's ultimate justice, in an afterlife where current sufferings would be redeemed, and in the potential for divine intervention in this life through prayer and proper observance, all helped sustain people through the very real hardships of medieval existence. The community aspect of religious practice cannot be overstated. Shared beliefs and rituals strengthened social bonds, creating a sense of collective identity and purpose. Religious celebrations brought people together in positive contexts that balanced the more pragmatic interactions of daily work. Even the confession of sins and performance of penance had community dimensions, as public penance for serious transgressions helped restore social harmony. This integrated spirituality, blending official religion, folk practices, communal, ritual and personal devotion, created a world where the sacred and mundane were not separate spheres, but aspects of a single reality. The medieval peasant did not go to church in the modern sense of temporarily entering a religious space. They inhabited a world where church teachings, seasonal rituals, ancient customs, and daily spiritual practices formed an interwoven fabric of meaning and identity. Myths and storytelling stories formed the primary medium for transmitting knowledge, values, and identity in the largely non-literate peasant communities. These narratives, shared around evening fires or during communal work, served multiple vital functions beyond mere entertainment. Religious stories drawn from scripture, saint's lives and apocryphal traditions provided moral instruction and models for behavior. The Bible stories heard in church would be retold and elaborated, often with local color or practical applications added. Saints' lives, particularly those of locally venerated figures, offered examples of virtue, courage, and faith set in contexts that peasants could relate to. St. Isidore the farmer, for instance, whose angels helped plow his fields while he prayed. Folk tales, passed down through generations with endless variations, encoded practical wisdom and social values in memorable narratives. Stories of clever peasants outwitting greedy lords or dangerous supernatural beings encouraged resourcefulness and quick thinking. Tales of the consequences of breaking taboos or moral codes reinforced community standards. Narratives about helping mysterious strangers who turned out to be disguised holy figures encouraged hospitality and kindness. Mythological stories, though officially replaced by Christian narratives, often survived in altered forms or as stories of the old times. These might explain natural features of the local landscape, how a particular hill or lake was formed, or account for seasonal patterns. They connected the community to its pre-Christian past while incorporating new religious elements. Historical. Narratives, though often blending fact with legend, preserved important community memories. Stories of particular floods, famines, or plagues might contain practical information about how previous generations had survived similar disasters. Tales of conflicts with neighboring villages or negotiations with authorities maintained awareness of boundaries and rights. Narratives about the founding of the village or the building of the church reinforced local identity. Genealogical stories traced family connections and inherited characteristics, maintaining awareness of kinship networks beyond the immediate family. These narratives might emphasize particular family traits, skill in a craft, a tendency toward certain illnesses, or notable physical features, creating a sense of continuity across generations. The art of storytelling itself was valued, with particularly skilled narrators gaining status in the community. These individuals might specialize in certain types of tales or develop distinctive performance styles. The best storytellers combined faithful transmission of traditional elements with creative adaptation to current circumstances and audience, keeping ancient tales relevant to new generations. Stories were not mere passive entertainment, but interactive experiences. Audiences might participate through call and response elements, by joining in familiar refrains, or by contributing details to well-known narratives. This participation strengthened memory of the tales and created a sense of ownership and investment in the shared narrative tradition. The context for storytelling varied. Winter evenings, when darkness came early and outdoor work was limited, provided the classic setting for extended narrative sessions. Certain seasonal celebrations called for specific traditional tales. Work gatherings, particularly tasks like spinning or shelling beans that occupied the hands but left the mind free, created opportunities for sharing shorter stories or communal building of narratives, where each person contributed a portion. Children were gradually introduced to the community's story traditions, beginning with simple tales and eventually hearing the full range of narratives. This progressive exposure served as a form of education, transmitting practical knowledge, moral values, and community history in digestible portions appropriate to the child's development. Dreams were often incorporated into narrative traditions, with significant dreams retold as potential omens or divine messages. The boundaries between dream experience, supernatural encounter, and traditional narrative were fluid, with each informing the understanding of the others. The visual arts complemented oral storytelling. Church paintings and carvings depicted biblical narratives and saints' lives for those who could not read texts. Decorative elements on everyday objects, carved bedposts, embroidered clothing, painted furniture, might represent elements of well-known stories, creating constant visual reminders of the narrative tradition. Seasonal performances, mystery, plays at Easter, mummers' plays at Christmas, May Day celebrations, enacted traditional narratives allowing community members to temporarily embody characters from the shared story world. These performances reinforced narrative traditions while creating powerful emotional and sensory experiences that deepened their impact. Music and storytelling were often intertwined, with ballads narrating historical events or legendary tales. These musical forms aided memory through their rhythmic and melodic structures, helping preserve narratives across generations even without written records. The medieval peasant thus inhabited a world rich with stories, sacred and secular, ancient and contemporary, practical and fantastical. These narratives provided explanation for natural phenomena, instruction in practical skills, transmission of social values, emotional processing of hardships, entertainment during monotonous work, and a sense of identity and continuity in a world of uncertainties. Far from being mere diversion, stories constituted an essential technology for survival and cultural transmission in a society without widespread literacy or formal educational institutions. The medieval village structure. and governance layout and organization. The physical layout of a medieval village reflected both practical necessities and social organization, developing organically over generations in response to local conditions rather than following a predetermined plan. Most villages centered around a nucleus of buildings, typically including the church, a village green or common area, perhaps a manor house if the lord resided locally, and possibly a mill if water power was available. Around this core clustered the peasant homes, usually arranged along one or more rough roads or paths. The placement of the village itself was carefully chosen based on several critical factors. Access to water was paramount. Most settlements developed near rivers, streams, or springs that provided drinking water, power for mills, and sometimes transportation. Protection from flooding meant building on slightly elevated ground near, but not in, floodplains. Good drainage was essential for preventing the settlement from becoming a muddy morass during rainy seasons. Defensive considerations also influenced village placement. While peasant villages lacked the walls and fortifications of towns, they might be situated where natural features offered some protection, on a small rise backed by a river or steep slope, or in a location with good visibility of approaching travelers. The relationship to agricultural land shaped village form as well. The settlement needed to be central to the fields that sustained it, minimizing travel time for workers. Different village forms evolved in different regions. The nucleated village with houses clustered together and surrounded by fields was common in many parts of England and northern France, while scattered farmsteads, connected by paths, characterized parts of Germany and Scandinavia. Within the village, the church typically occupied the most prominent position. As both the spiritual center and often the only stone building, it served as a landmark, meeting place, and emergency shelter. The churchyard surrounding it contained the community's burial ground, creating a literal overlap between the living community and its ancestors. The village green or common area served multiple functions. It provided space for community gatherings, festivals, markets, and the grazing of livestock. In some regions, this common land included a pond for watering animals and providing emergency water for firefighting. Individual homesteads typically consisted of a house, perhaps a small barn or shed, and a garden plot or toft, an enclosed area for intensive cultivation of vegetables and herbs. These plots were generally surrounded by fences or hedges to protect them from wandering livestock and to mark property boundaries. The size and construction of homes varied by region and family resources. In woodland areas, timber-framed structures with wattle and daub walls predominated. In regions with less timber, homes might be built primarily of stone, clay, or turf. Regional variations created distinctive architectural styles that reflected available materials and climatic conditions. Beyond, the immediate village center stretched the arable fields, the primary agricultural land that provided the community's sustenance. These were typically divided into 2 or 3 large fields, which were further subdivided into strips allocated to different families. This open field system, with its scattered strips rather than consolidated holdings, allowed each family access to different soil types and conditions, spreading risk across the community. Surrounding the arable fields might be areas of meadow for hay production, pasture for grazing livestock, and woodland for timber, firewood, and foraging. Access to these resources was often governed by complex customary rights that had evolved over generations. The boundaries between villages were marked by various features: streams, ridges, ancient trees, stone markers, or distinctive landscape elements. These boundaries were reinforced through beating the bounds, ceremonial processions in which community members, particularly children who would need to remember the boundaries longest, walked the perimeter of the village lands, often stopping at significant markers for prayers or symbolic actions. Roads connecting the village to neighboring settlements, market towns, or pilgrimage sites formed vital arteries for trade, information exchange, and social connections beyond the immediate community. These routes often followed ancient pathways, determined by landscape features and ease of travel rather than direct lines. Water management shaped village infrastructure. Wells for drinking water might be communal or associated with individual households, depending on the depth of the water table. Streams might be diverted for mill power, with careful attention to maintaining access for all who needed water. Drainage ditches helped manage rainwater and prevent flooding of houses and fields. The village's physical organization reflected its social hierarchy. The manor house, if present, typically occupied a prominent position, often slightly separated from peasant dwellings. Within the peasant community, the relative size and quality of houses might indicate the status of different families, from the more substantial dwellings of prosperous peasants who held more land to the simpler homes of cottagers with minimal land rights. The built environment evolved continuously as families expanded, structures aged and were rebuilt, or new facilities were added. Unlike modern planned developments, medieval villages grew organically, with each generation adapting the settlement to its needs while working within the framework inherited from previous inhabitants. Natural disasters, fire, flood, or severe storms might occasionally force more dramatic reorganization. After such events, the community might rebuild in a slightly different pattern, incorporating lessons learned from the disaster while maintaining connections to established agricultural lands and water sources. This physical arrangement of the medieval village reflected and reinforced its social organization, a community bound together by proximity, shared resources, and mutual dependence for survival. The visible, tangible nature of these connections, houses clustered together, fields worked side by side, paths crossing daily, created a literal landscape of community that shaped the medieval peasants' understanding of their place in the social world. Rights and responsibilities. The medieval peasant lived within a complex system of rights and obligations that governed relationships between individuals, families, the broader community, and authorities like lords and the church. This system, though often portrayed simplistically as mere exploitation of peasants by nobility, actually represented a sophisticated social contract that had evolved over centuries to manage limited resources and maintain social stability. The foundation of this system lay land tenure, the arrangements by which peasants accessed the agricultural land essential for survival. Various categories of peasant status existed, defined primarily by their relationship to the land. Serfs, also called villeins in some regions, held land from a lord in exchange for significant labor obligations and payments. They were bound to the soil, meaning they could not legally leave their holdings without permission. While this represented a form of unfreedom, it also provided security. Serfs could not be arbitrarily evicted from their land as long as they fulfilled their obligations. Free peasants held land through various arrangements, requiring less onerous obligations. They might pay money rent rather than labor services, have greater freedom of movement, and possess more legal rights. The distinction between free and unfree status varied by region and period, with a general trend toward increased freedom over the course of the medieval period. Cottagers, or bourdars, held smaller plots insufficient for full subsistence, supplementing their farming with wage labor, crafts, or specialized skills like blacksmithing or carpentry. Their obligations were generally proportional to their smaller holdings. Landless laborers represented the most vulnerable category, working for wages or room and board without the security of land rights. They might be permanently landless or temporarily displaced, younger sons waiting to establish their own households or individuals who had lost land through misfortune. For those with land rights, the obligations that came with these rights varied widely by region and over time. Labor service, called week work, required working a specified number of days on the lord's domain land. Boon work involved additional labor during critical periods like harvest. Payments might be made in agricultural products, money, or both. Additional obligations included heriot, payment when a tenant died and the holding passed to an heir, and merchet, payment when a serf's daughter married outside the manor. In return for these obligations, peasants received not just access to land, but various rights and protections. The right to remain on ancestral holdings as long as obligations were met provided crucial security in a world without welfare systems. Access to common resources, pasture for grazing animals, woods for timber and foraging, streams for fishing, supplemented what could be produced on individual plots. The lord was expected to provide protection from external threats and administration of justice for internal conflicts. Beyond individual relationships with lords, peasants held rights and responsibilities within the village community itself. Common fields required coordinated management. Decisions about when to plow, plant and harvest, which crops to grow in which fields, and how to handle fallow periods. These decisions were often made collectively through village assemblies or councils of householders. Access to communal resources came with corresponding responsibilities for sustainable management. The number of animals each household could graze on common pasture was carefully regulated to prevent overuse. Woodlands were managed through systems like coppicing that ensured continuous renewable yield. These arrangements represented sophisticated environmental management developed through generations of experience. The maintenance of village infrastructure constituted another shared responsibility. Roads, bridges, drainage ditches, and communal buildings required regular work that was allocated among households according to established customs. Failure to contribute fairly to these efforts would result in social sanctions or formal penalties. The church imposed its own set of rights and obligations. Peasants were required to pay tithes, theoretically 1/10 of their produce, to support the church and its clergy. In return, they received spiritual services, masses, sacraments, prayers, and often practical assistance like basic medical care, conflict resolution, or advocacy with secular authorities. Religious obligations extended beyond financial support. Attendance at Mass, observance of holy days, which could number 50 or more throughout the year, participation in religious processions, and adherence to practices like fasting during Lent and Advent were expected of all community members. Legal rights varied significantly by region and status. Even serfs typically had access to manorial courts where disputes could be resolved and complaints heard according to local custom. While these courts were overseen by the lord or his representatives, they generally operated according to established procedures rather than arbitrary rule. Records show that peasants sometimes successfully defended their customary rights against encroachment by lords through these legal mechanisms. Families had obligations to care for their vulnerable members, the elderly, orphaned children, and those with disabilities. When a family could not meet these obligations, the broader community or parish might provide assistance through informal arrangements or more structured support, like poor relief administered by the church. The balance of rights and responsibilities was maintained through multiple enforcement mechanisms. Lords maintained their authority through control of land access and legal jurisdiction, but their power was constrained by custom, church teachings on proper treatment of dependents, and practical limitations. A lord who pushed exploitation too far might face passive resistance, reduced productivity, or even revolt. Within the community, social pressure provided powerful enforcement of expectations. Those who failed to maintain their portion of communal infrastructure, who overused common resources, or who violated social norms faced gossip, reduced cooperation from neighbors, and potentially exclusion from mutual aid networks that were essential for survival. More formal enforcement came through various courts: manorial courts for issues related to land and local governance, church courts for religious and moral matters, and royal courts for serious crimes or disputes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. These overlapping systems created multiple avenues for resolving conflicts and maintaining social order. What emerged from this complex web of rights and responsibilities was a social system that, while hierarchical and often harsh by modern standards, provided a functional framework for managing limited resources and maintaining community cohesion. Peasants were not merely passive victims of exploitation, but active participants in a system of reciprocal obligations that created sufficient stability for communities to survive across generations, despite the precarious nature of medieval agriculture and frequent external threats. The medieval peasant thus inhabited a social world defined not primarily by individual freedom, but by embedded relationships to family, community, lord, church, and land itself. Each relationship carried both constraints and protections, limitations and entitlements, creating a network of mutual obligation that differed fundamentally from our modern emphasis on individual rights and contractual relationships. Conclusion. Echoes of medieval life in our modern world. As our journey through medieval peasant life draws to a close, we might reflect on the echoes of this distant world that continue to resonate in our modern existence. Despite the vast technological and social changes that separate us from our medieval ancestors, certain fundamental patterns and insights from their way of life continue to influence how we live today. The physical landscapes we inhabit, still, bear the imprints of medieval organization. Many European villages, towns, and even cities follow street patterns established in medieval times. Field boundaries, woodland edges, and parish borders often trace lines first marked out by medieval communities. The distribution of settlements across the landscape, their relationship to water sources, agricultural land, and transportation routes frequently reflects decisions made by medieval inhabitants responding to the practical necessities of their world. Our calendar and its rhythms preserve medieval patterns of work and celebration. The weekend as a time of rest evolved from the medieval Sunday observance. Many public holidays have direct medieval origins: Christmas, Easter, and numerous saints' days that have been secularized but retain their position in the annual cycle. Even the academic calendar, with its long summer break, reflects the medieval need for all hands, including children's, during the crucial harvest season. Food traditions connect us directly to medieval kitchens. Bread as a dietary staple, cheese-making techniques, brewing and wine-making practices, the preservation of meat through smoking and curing. All these fundamental elements of European food culture developed their familiar forms during the medieval period. Regional food specialties often originated as practical adaptations to local conditions by medieval communities. Family structures and expectations still show the influence of medieval patterns, though significantly modified. The concept of the household as an economic unit, the expectation that children will eventually care for aging parents, the marking of life transitions through communal celebration. These elements of family life would be recognizable to our medieval ancestors, even as many details have changed. Linguistic traces of medieval life pepper our everyday speech. Common phrases like rule of thumb, by hook or by crook, or getting down to brass tacks originated in medieval work practices. Our vocabulary for emotions, relationships, and moral concepts was largely shaped during this period as vernacular. Languages developed their expressive capacity alongside Latin. Governance systems at the local level often evolved from medieval arrangements. Town councils, parish meetings, and other forms of community decision-making frequently build on foundations established during the medieval period. The principle of subsidiarity, that matters should be handled by the smallest, lowest, or least centralized competent authority, reflects the practical reality of medieval governance. Land use concepts like the commons, resources that belong to or affect an entire community, have medieval origins and are finding renewed relevance in discussions of environmental management, digital spaces, and cultural heritage. The medieval experience offers models for sustainable resource management that developed over centuries of practical experience. Craft traditions connect us to medieval workmanship. While mass production has replaced many handcrafts, the recent revival of interest in traditional crafts, woodworking, blacksmithing, textile arts, ceramics, represents a renewed appreciation for the skilled handwork that characterized medieval material culture. The satisfaction of creating physical objects with one's hands speaks to a human need that was central to medieval experience. Perhaps most profoundly, the medieval integration of life domains offers a counterpoint to our modern compartmentalization. Where we separate work, home, education, spirituality, and community into distinct spheres, the medieval peasant experienced these as aspects of a unified whole. As we grapple with work-life balance, seek meaning beyond material consumption, and look for more sustainable ways of living, the medieval model of an integrated life embedded in natural cycles and community relationships offers provocative alternatives to contemporary assumptions. This is not to romanticize the very real hardships of medieval existence or to suggest a literal return to medieval practices. Rather, It is to recognize that our medieval ancestors developed sophisticated responses to fundamental human challenges: how to sustain communities over generations, how to find meaning in the cycles of work and rest, how to balance individual needs with collective welfare that may still have relevance as we face our own existential questions in a very different world. As we conclude our gentle journey through medieval daily life, we might carry forward not just increased historical understanding, but also an expanded sense of possibility for how human communities might organize themselves, find meaning, and create sustainable relationships with the natural world. Our medieval ancestors, for all the limitations of their technology and knowledge, created ways of living that sustained countless generations through challenges as severe as any we face today. Their story is not just a curious chapter of the past, but part of the ongoing human conversation about how best to live in community with each other and with the earth that sustains us. With this reflection, we truly bid good night to our medieval village, its smoky homes, its ordered fields, its rhythmic days and seasons, its web of relationships. May your dreams be as peaceful as a summer evening in that distant world, where the last light fades over ripening fields and the village settles into well-earned rest after another day in the great cycle of medieval life. Good night.